When it comes to the topic of the GOAT of energy drinks, the greatest of all time, I would obviously choose Gamersups, the energy formula that's got 0 carbs, it's delicious flavours, not all horrible and chemically, has a nice slow release with a long plateau and then a very nice gentle taper off, not a hard crash after a crazy spike. Also, did you know, since I'm British, obviously, they've got tea now, haven't they? That's right. They've got the tea, where they've got these gamer teas they've made, where they've got 4 different types. You've got like, let's see, they've got the black tea, the classic one there. You've got the ginger turmeric. They're quite actually good things to take into your body, good things for your health if you don't know. They've got the yerba mate, just a classic type of tea. And then they've got this one, which is particularly good, which is sleepy time with theanine. Theanine's actually a supplement I take anyway for sleep. It aids sleep, basically. And so I would actually say this one has no caffeine in even. This one will pair quite well with classic Gamersups, right? Because you'll have the Gamersups earlier in the day, get your work done or do whatever you need to do. Then at night, you'll have this to help yourself go off to sleep and not feel too hyper, right? As usual, use the code Thorin for 10% off, THORIN, at gamesups.gg. Anything you might like to order, including these teas. Now, when it comes to the topic of the GOAT of MMA, it's actually something which is constantly discussed within that sport. And there have been so many Johnny-come-lately, newer modern-day casuals and nephews and fans out there who just do what they do with every single sport right now, which is they just take whoever's really good now. So a couple of years ago, it was Khabib, and now they're going to say it's like Makhachev soon, or maybe they say it's Jon Jones still, or whoever. And what they do is they just say that person's the GOAT, right? And the problem is, as with almost every sport and discipline, their confidence and certainty it's the GOAT isn't really based on did they see the other people play, how good were they, what's their understanding of the sport. It's just like they like that person the most. So since I am actually someone who's watched MMA a long time, I've thought about making this video many, many times over the years, and obviously my answer potentially could have changed over the years about who is the GOAT of MMA, mixed martial arts, who is the greatest of all time. And notice I didn't say who is the GOAT of UFC, Ultimate Fighting Championship, because actually at different points in time, either politics within the UFC, like what happened with Mighty Mouse or John Fitch or certain Musashi, etc. Sometimes people actually who can be the best or among the best in their weight class are off in other promotions. Most famously, obviously, people like Fedor did all their great work outside of the UFC. There's people who did half and half in Pride in the UFC. And then there's some people who had some periods in the UFC, some periods out of the UFC, some people who only in the UFC. But I'm counting all MMA. I don't only care about the UFC in this particular sense. So I don't feel I will punish someone like Demetrious Johnson, except that at times maybe there wasn't the same level of competition elsewhere in other divisions outside the UFC. But actually he was fighting in one where, to be fair, that is a pretty good division anywhere in the world right now. So when it comes to doing the MMA GOAT, what I want to do is, you know how I do it in esports if you've watched any of my content. The number one factor is always the eye test. I don't care what your record is, or like, unless I actually watch the video and you look like the greatest fighter of all time, you don't get to be number one on this list. Now, I do then consider things like record because it's a 1v1 sport. Even so, the judges get it wrong sometimes. Sometimes there are scandalous things like, I don't even know if Jose Aldo should get to count that win over Chad Mendes. He basically held onto the fence, otherwise he would have been taken down. Then who knows what happens? Right after that, he ended the fight, didn't he? So that does sort of trouble me somewhat. Those are examples of ones where the win isn't as easy as it seems on paper when it just says you won by KO or TKO or whatever. So I do care about record, but I care more in the sense of how dominant you are with that record, like whether I think you won the fights, and particularly dominance in your era. You can only fight the people you fought, were put up against in your era, as long as you didn't intentionally dodge fighting people. So as a result, like, it's not also the case of like, well, everyone now's better and faster and stronger. I'm sick of all that with the NBA, by the way. They get injured all the time and say, oh, a million games. People, Karl Malone used to play every game of the whole fucking career, it felt like, back in the NBA. So that also is a whack angle. I care about how you did against the people of your era. And then also, I care about your skill set. Like, actually, how good are you at the sport? It's not just do you win or do you look good winning? Like, how actually skillful are you? How good are you at what you do in MMA? What's your strength and how much can you lean into? How well-rounded are you? What weaknesses do you have? How do you show them up? How do you respond when someone who stylistically counters you actually comes along? By the way, one of the problems with this discussion, I'll tell you right now, is there are certain eras in time when the UFC, almost certainly, you could tell if they liked or didn't like a fighter or thought he was a draw or not. Because there are some fighters, I'm just going to say straight up, they intentionally kept away from certain strong types of fighter. Like, for example, I think at this point in time, it is just obvious they kept certain stand-up fighters away from certain very strong ground fighters. There's certain very strong ground fighters they kept away from different style of ground fighters who might have been the counter to them. They've done that many, many times, and the UFC is full of all sorts of nonsense. So let's dive into it, because I thought the approach I'll take, a bit like when I'm doing my videos where I go through wikis in like Counter-Strike, for example, telling you about a team, is I thought we'll do the same thing. We'll just pull up the wikis. I'll just show you each of these guys, and then we'll talk about how good they are. So what I've done is this is going to be a proper full-on video where I not only will tell you at the end who I think is the GOAT of MMA, so who is Thorin's GOAT, but I'm going to show you a whole bunch of different people, because I also think anytime you have a discussion like this, the first thing you are tasked with doing is not saying, well, I think it's only one of these three people, so here's the three people. Because what you're doing there is working backwards. You've already clearly done the whole process and then decided who your GOAT is. No. I'm going to show you on camera now how I show you and determine who the GOAT is. So the first thing I've got to do, to be fair, is put all the people who deserve to initially be in the conversation and considered onto the list. Then I will eliminate loads of them. So we'll do that first. Spoiler, the first, 10 names or something I'm going to do. We're all going to be the ones we're going to eliminate quickly. And I'm going to essentially explain why they aren't the GOAT. Then I'll narrow it down to my shortlist, and from that I will then, with heavy emphasis on what my particular biases are, tell you who I think is the GOAT. So first things first, the first person who, if you just be listening, isn't the GOAT, but he definitely deserves to be in consideration and to be mentioned in this conversation, even if he's then eliminated, is going to be Jose Aldo. Just to stress again for people who don't know, because he's Brazilian, you pronounce it Jose. If he was someone from a Spanish country like Mexico, it would be Jose, but in this case it's Jose Aldo. Now, if people don't know, he actually initially got his buzz, as you'll see here, fighting way back before he got to the UFC. Over here, you see, WEC. Now, WEC was a promotion that at one point was bought by the UFC and simultaneously owned in both regards. But before that was mainly famous for, as well as actually having some of the higher weight classes, it was most famous for having the lower weight classes. Before the UFC did, when the UFC only went as low as lightweight, this was the promotion where you would actually see lower weight fights like featherweight, etc., as you see here from Jose Aldo. You would see them fighting there. Then there came a weird point where both companies were owned by the people who own the UFC, and there was sort of like simultaneously two divisions for certain weight classes. And then what happened is eventually they took all the lower weight classes and added them into UFC. And famously, people like Jose Aldo were a part of that because they were part of the transition going over to the UFC, like Dominick Cruz and all the others from that particular era. So the key thing is, all these WEC wins definitely do count for Jose Aldo in a conversation like this. These are some of the best fighters of all time at this weight class. If you go down here, even though we're going back to like over 10 years now, look at some of the people he's fighting when he gets to the WEC Eliminator and then eventually the championship. So you look down here, you're not going to know as many of these names, right? Okay, that's fair enough. Who cares about some of these fights in Brazil, Timmy's Roundup? But then you get to WEC. So you go here, right? Immediately, you all should know who Cobb Swanson is if you watch the UFC. This is someone who's been in his weight class for many, many years. He's been a competitive fighter. And you see, he's TKO'd him as Jose Aldo. Then he's fought Mike Brown. By the way, Mike Brown was a champion at this weight class, or lightweight or whatever. TKOs him, knocks him the fuck out. Then he fights Uriah Faber here. Now, if people don't know, this Uriah Faber one only says decision unanimous because Uriah Faber is an insane warrior of MMA. If you ever saw how destroyed Uriah Faber's leg was in that fight, that, like, in theory, in a sane world, your coach just throws the towel in. Like, there was no reason for that to go the distance. You could never have won if you're Uriah Faber at some point in time. But he just hung in there and let himself get absolutely destroyed. It's like one of the nastiest, like, leg kick fights of all time. That's when people were terrified of Jose Aldo. Then you have this one here. This was a solid enough opponent at the time. Knocks him out. Now, he's over now in the UFC because what happens is it becomes the UFC Featherweight Championship. Everyone remembers the Hominick fight. It was going all right until it wasn't, and there was that massive hematoma on Hominick's head. Kenny Florian had been through all those weight classes and wanted his chance to win. You're not going to beat Jose Aldo at this point in time. Chaz Mendes, as I say, even though he KO'd him, I don't like the cheat angle. Like, look, here's the problem with that one. in theory, cheating outside of this sport, like steroids or PEDs, I can't really know if you did do that, if you didn't. It's hard. So that one, I don't look at. I don't look at if you're a scumbag in general. But this is cheating in the fight. I don't like cheating in the fight. That is a problem I have. With that said, maybe you still KO him anyway. I mean, look, maybe there's enough time in the fight, you just did it in a different round. That's also plausible. It's not like Chad Mendes ever became a champion himself. He was just a good contender. Then you have Frankie Edgar, who was himself a champion at a different weight class and was a very good fighter. He took care of him. You have the Korean Zombie here, who I always thought was a dangerous contender. He TKO'd him. Famously, I think that was the one where his shoulder separated, so you'll never really know what could happen in that fight. Ricardo Lamas was a solid contender. I think he was a wrestler from memory. You have the Chad Mendes rematch here. This is just a decision this time. That helps, obviously, since the one before I told you had that shenanigans. These are all, remember, championship fights. Then, sadly, famously, he lost to Conor McGregor, who himself had beaten, obviously, in an interim fight, Chad Mendes, and become the champion, etc. And then the problem with the Conor McGregor one is this, and this is one of the big factors that does stop Jose Aldo being in the actual category at the end of this video where you get to be potentially the GOAT, is this fight right here, if Jose Aldo wins, is a mega feather in his cap, because as people will know, Conor McGregor's actual resume is one of the rare ones in MMA which didn't get worse over time, like you'll see with GSPs, for example. It got better over time, because actually people like Max Holloway got even better, Dustin Poirier got even better. Jose Aldo was at the time potentially the GOAT of the division. Uriah Babe, you know what I mean? I mean, it's just in the division, but you get the point. Like, these sorts of people, their resume looks way better now. If you Conor McGregor, obviously he fought fucking Alvarez. He fought a load of people, and now it looks even better. So if you could have beaten Conor McGregor at this point in time, if you're Jose Aldo, that does a lot for you. But unfortunately, not only did you lose, you lost instantly. Basically, the first punch thrown, it felt like. And also in a way where it's so conclusive the way you lost, that even though it's certainly not the case that it's a conclusive fight and you could never beat Conor McGregor, they shouldn't have done a rematch. I think they desperately should have done a rematch of that fight personally. But it does give off the vibe to people like, you got KO'd, who cares? And so sadly, I always thought that was a crime, a travesty that fight was never run back. I wanted to see what would happen in that one. And actually, I mean, we saw since then, Jose Aldo never has been quite the same fighter again since. I do think Conor McGregor somewhat got in his head. Maybe even the stage of being at fighting at the biggest level got to Jose Aldo. Who knows? The point is, though, he still was an excellent fighter after that, but he never was quite the same, and he wasn't the same intimidating force, was he? So after that, you see, he fought Frankie Edgar. That's fine. The Max Holloway losses now don't even sound that bad for being knockouts, because one, himself, Jose Aldo, comes back and still very good. But then secondly, Max Holloway went on to be an extremely good fighter and a champion himself. He knocks out Jeremy Stephens, dangerous striker. You keep going up. He lost to Volkanovski. That doesn't even seem bad now. Volkanovski himself's going to be on this list as a potential GOAT, isn't he? So again, these results aren't looking that bad. Like, actually, this resume is looking legit. Even the losses. You go up. Okay, this isn't that great because this is just kind of an okay fighter, isn't it, Marias? Then you have the Peter Yan. Now, to be fair, Peter Yan himself, a championship level fighter, right? It's not the end of the world you lost to him. He's someone you could argue even should have been the champion a bit longer, right? There was all that shenanigans with his later fight. So actually the losses, aside from this one, aren't even that bad. Then you have the win over Cheeto. Cheeto's a dangerous fighter. That's pretty legit. You have the Pedro Munoz one. Pedro Munoz was certainly not a bomb. He had an all right fight with Dominick Cruz. Rob Font's like a UFC veteran. You look here. Okay, nice win. Now, yeah, this guy you've lost over. Right now, you're going to go, what the hell? By the way, this is someone where, give it 2 or 3 years, this is going to be a very competitive fighter. This is a guy who potentially could be a champion himself. So when you actually look at it, I think Jose Aldo's resume is mad underrated. Look how many fights he's had. 39 fights, and a whole bunch of them are against, like, basically top 5 competition for years and years and years. We're talking like over a decade fighting top competition. Now, himself, only at the absolute peak level, let's be real, like I say, up until, when was the Conor McGregor fight? Until around like 2015 or so. So let's say like 6-7 years ago was when it started to fall off a bit for Jose Aldo. But you'll see he's such an all-time great. He still did have a very fantastic competitive record against a lot of other people. Then you want to talk about eye test. At his peak, he's an incredibly dangerous fighter. And also, by the way, he is Brazilian. Like, if he wanted to, he could have fucked around potentially with some submissions, etc. The point is, this is a stand-up fighter. He doesn't need to. This is a guy where, for me, the real problem Jose Aldo had was this. As soon as he fought certain people who not only themselves were very good at striking, but either had crazy power or mega speed. That's when I think he had problems. Because to me, he was a fighter where it looked to me like he was always used to being slightly faster than the other guy, always getting off before the other guy. Actually reminds me a bit of BJ Penn, which I might talk about later in this particular episode. So there we go. Jose Aldo, fantastic, quite dominant to one point in time. Then the latter half of his career, not so dominant. Skill set, pretty skilled all-round fighter, actually. It's just that whatever happened mentally to him, and potentially, you could argue maybe his chin got a little bit worse over the years. That tends to happen with people who've taken a lot of damage. So yeah, I think absolutely must be included in one of these conversations. Then we'll go on to the next one. It's around a similar weight class, right? Now we're going to go to Dominick Cruz. So this is a guy who was a two-time UFC bantamweight champion, and he himself got his start in the WEC, just like Jose Aldo. So if we go all the way down here, you have the Rage in the Cage stuff, which is years and years back. See, these aren't even people that have listings. By the way, spoiler, if someone doesn't even have a Wikipedia entry, they might actually be a good fighter. It might be a long, long time ago. But it means they didn't go on to be a famous fighter in promotions like the UFC. So you ignore them. Like if this is a Brazilian fighter, loads of them here will just be local Brazilian fights. So similarly, who cares about these Arizona fights here? So you scroll up and you go to WEC. And what's that? WEC debut for Dominick Cruz is against fucking Uriah Faber. If you don't know, Uriah Faber, who I've talked about just in the last one with Jose Aldo, was beaten by Jose Aldo. This is the way it went, though. Faber helped to, in wrestling style, put over some of the other greats of the weight classes he was in, because actually Uriah Faber was the man in the WEC around this point in time. He was the guy who was the champion at one point in time. Like, this is where Faber himself wins the WEC featherweight title. So after that, though, Cruz comes back, and look, he's winning a bunch of decisions. By the way, in general, there's a reason people often called him, instead of the Dominator, the decisionator. He did have a lot of decisions, because if you know his style of fighting, Dominick Cruz, it's like a Machida style. It's about doing some damage to your opponent, but essentially controlling the fight and the movement of where it takes place, and taking as little damage as possible, and using technique and timing and getting in and out to just touch them and just touch them up a bit, just touch them more and score some points and move around and not let them control where the fight's hitting. So it's all about chess play with Dominick Cruz. This isn't a guy who's here to knock you out. So you look at the rest of his career, then you come up here, you go to like Ian McCall. This was a dangerous contender at his later on in the UFC. You might remember when they first launched the weight classes. This guy was a solid fighter. Joseph Benedit was right around there. Now you'll see when I talk about Mike Mouse later. This is an example of someone I do think meant that the division was a little bit shallow, but he's still a skilled fighter. Jorgensen, if you don't remember, this guy was quite scary once upon a time in the WEC. He fights Uriah Faber, wins against him. So when he's the WEC into UFC champion at this point in time, he fights Faber again, defeats him in a unanimous decision. He beats Mighty Mouse as before Mighty Mouse went to a different weight class. By the way, Mighty Mouse himself is a GOAT candidate. Dominick Cruz has beaten him. Then he did that crazy layover. This is the problem with Dominick Cruz's career. I'm actually convinced if he'd never had the injuries, that he actually would be in my final GOAT discussion, like 3 to 4 names that for real I picked the GOAT from. And he might even be someone I would pick. Like, I probably wouldn't have picked him because he wasn't like a crazy knockout/finish artist. But I do think he was a fantastic tactician and an IQ fighter. I think he was phenomenal. So you go look here at some of the people he fought, but you look at the year gaps. So you go back, look, 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. Okay, what the hell? 3-year gap. That's because Dominick Cruz, when he was the champion, kept getting injured over and over. And at one point, people thought he might either never come back or he'll just never be a great fighter again. So even though this is way back in 2014, he then came back from injury, and this was his tune-up fight against Mizugaki. And if you remember, this is the one where actually he beat the fuck out of him, beat him with knockout. He actually punched him loads. And so that already was like, whoa. And then we had the fight, which at the time was going to be a legacy fight because TJ Dillashaw had made himself the champion. If you don't know, he almost is like someone who copied the style of fighting of Dominick Cruz, and which is funny because DJ Dillashaw comes from the alpha male Uriah Faber gym, which at the time, including from this fight actually, all the people from that gym had been beaten by who? Dominick Cruz. So it was almost like a mirror match, and people even said DJ Dillashaw's younger, he's faster, he's got the same style in and out. Well, you know what? This was a really good competitive fight, and I think he could score it both ways, but I agree with the decision. I actually do think Dominick Cruz won this fight. I think even if you look, I actually think Dillashaw himself even knows he lost it slightly, and so he wins that one. He gets another fight because Faber was just box office. Gets another title fight against Faber, beats him. So at this point in time, he's done a comeback, and then he's beaten two people who in this weight class will go down as all-time greats, Faber and Dillashaw, on his return. Faber a little bit more long in the tooth at this point in time. Dillashaw right in his prime, if anything. It's supposed to be Dillashaw winning that fight and taking sort of the put over nature of Cruz's name and using that to build his status. But actually, Dominick Cruz did what all the two all-time greats are able to do, which is you nick a few when you're past your prime. After that, yes, obviously Dominick Cruz is much older in his career and he hasn't been as good. Like, he lost to Cody Garbrandt, and he actually won one of the rare fights where he was properly beaten. He was soundly, convincingly beaten. I don't think anyone would score that for Dominick Cruz. It was a decision, but even so, like, I actually think it even also shows Dominick Cruz had a half-decent chin, because there's a world actually that he could have got knocked out in this fight. Then he came back, you saw there, another 4-year gap. He came back when there was no crowd, because of you know what, and fought Cejudo. Now, this was for the championship, and it was short notice as far as I remember, because I think someone else pulled out and then Dominick Cruz took the fight on like short notice. That's what I remember, at least. Now, as a result, maybe he didn't have a full camp, but Cejudo at this point in time is like a younger, better fighter, and is himself, by the way, on this list of GOAT fighters. He didn't manage to beat him. It was a competitive fight. I actually do think like Cejudo, the pretty legit finish. I don't really care about all the like, it was too soon. No, this was fine. This was fine. Then he beat Casey Kenny, which was a bit of a whatever fight. He looked a lot better in the Munoz fight, and then Vera up here. I mean, again, he is a young contender who is dangerous, and Dominick Cruz is good, but until that point in the fight, he was going all right, but then he got knocked out. So Dominick Cruz, I do think, is a very special fighter. I think the injuries really wrecked his career, and I do actually think he's maybe only like... I think he maybe only has to get one of these bigger wins. Like, if he'd have won the Garbrandt fight or the Cejudo fight, obviously he won the Vera one, he'd be back in contention. But I think these two, if he'd have won one of those, it might have been enough to just bump him up over the line. But like I said, he'll always be a what if, because everyone will always ask what would have happened during the years between October 2011 and September 2014. If you can give me 2 or 3 years, because remember, he was a very active fighter when he could. If you give me like 5-6 more fights in that period, I actually am willing to almost guarantee you Dominick Cruz is on that latter list of the 3 people I'm picking from the GOAT of MMA. You might notice a trend here. We're starting off with some of the lighter weight classes initially, because there's actually a lot of people around there that have excellent resumes and have done fantastic things, but I do think you've got to eliminate them to have the serious discussion about who the absolute best is. Now, this will already upset some people, because I know this is some people's GOAT. Some people have Demetrious Johnson, a.k.a. Mighty Mouse, as the GOAT of MMA. And I will say, he has, in the context of who he was able to fight, a very good resume. The issue is, I do think actually that his resume is one of his biggest problems also, bearing in mind it's going to be used by many as his best case to make him a great fighter, right? So if you go back here, already most of these people, until Miguel Torres, you don't know most of these people. You might know Brad Pickett. I can believe you know him. Miguel Torres, you might know him around this time in the UFC. This is over 10 years ago, by the way. Then you got the Dominick Cruz loss. Okay, that's fine enough, because after that, you go from bantamweight, so go to flyweight. Then he becomes this mega fighter in flyweight, right? So you have this one, which was a draw, and then he came back and beat Ian McCall in a decision. Now, Ian McCall was a very good fighter, but he isn't on this list. So actually, these two fights are a bit like, it's a bit whatever, isn't it? You have a split decision with Benavidez, a good fighter. It's not a finish though, is it? By the way, if you don't ever get finishes, how can you be the greatest fighter of all time? I'm just saying that. Then you have this Jon Dodson, who was a dangerous fighter. He had clearly had like knockout power, another decision. You have a nice armbar here. Everyone remembers this one. It was a fucking amazing finish. Then you have the Benavidez rematch with a KO. Awesome. The problem then is this. You get people like this, right? Do you actually think at the end of MMA, this fighter will go down as one of the best of all time? Let's be real. You barely know who he is now. Then let's go to like some of these people. Is this fighter going to go down as all-time great? By the way, he doesn't even have a photo. Then let's go to this guy. Do you even know who this fighter is? This is the problem that Mighty Mouse had, is that these divisions are just a little bit shallow, but especially shallow in terms of name strength. Some of the fighters actually are quite skilled and good, like some of the ones I referenced earlier, but they don't have the same name as some of the people that fight at welterweight, light heavyweight, middleweight. These are divisions where the biggest ones of the biggest names are also the biggest killers. And therefore, if you are the GSPs and Anderson Silvas, you're putting crazy resumes down. The problem that you have if you're Mighty Mouse is I might know some of these guys are good, but some of them aren't going to ever be in consideration for these lists. Like how many essentially S tier or triple A wins do you have if you're Mighty Mouse? You have some, but the problem is you didn't get the win over Dominick Cruz. You get to the point later on, you lost to Henry Cejudo. Now you had wins as well. Look, you have this win here where you take on, but then later on he beat you. And a lot of people at that point in time saw that. I did as well, as the passing of the torch. That's when Cejudo kind of took over as the man at this weight class. Not Mighty Mouse anymore, who's still very good. In fact, the joke is if he kept fighting and he wanted to be in the UFC and the UFC would let him, he could be the champion again. So he even could be potentially. And then you look at some of the other names again. You just go look at some of these. Ray Borg. Impressive to you, is it? Wilson Race. Like these, none of these are bad fights. There's a reason they fight for the championship. But that division just never took off in the same way. It's, by the way, spoiler, the UFC isn't as harsh to Mighty Mouse as people say they are. Ooh, how can you say that, Thorin? It's prize fighting. It's not about, the UFC doesn't make like 10 bazillion and it's like, right, you're good, so you get your share. No, you get your share based on how many people buy the card because you're on it. And it was shown that Mighty Mouse just never sold cards. People did not care about watching this guy fight, partly because some of the decisions, partly because it's lower weight classes, partly because the names aren't there in the same way. And also, he was one of those people who wanted to do some config bullshit of like, I just fight and that's all I need to do. Well, then in that case, you'll never be the biggest fighter and you'll never get the crazy contracts you want because the greatest fighters fight and they do some shit talking, right? Or they're incredibly exciting fighters every fight, and that's what draws you. The problem Mighty Mouse is you've got to have a refined palate to understand how good he is at MMA and how exciting he is, because to other people, if you don't finish them, it looks like, well, how good was that move you did? What about that sub attempt? Wasn't even that good? They don't know Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example. So I do think he's an all-time great fighter, and like I say, he actually is one of the rare people on this list could keep going. It's just the problem is, he needs to get back in the UFC, doesn't he, to fight some of the big names there to add to the resume, because you look at who else he's fought. So you had this trilogy with Moraes. Okay, that's all right. There's no problem with that. These are all good fighters again. But look, since 2018, how many of these are going to be Hall of Famers? You know what I mean? So my issue there is this. I think people do exaggerate how good Demetrious Johnson is. Now, part of it is, you can only fight who you face, but we're talking about the greatest fighter of all time. I don't have to take a very, very good fighter or an excellent fighter. I can just take people who don't have these issues in their career. So then we're going to go to BJ Penn. By the way, one of my absolute favourite fighters of all time. There was a time, a long, long time ago, when everyone had smaller resumes, and it was way back in the era when people like BJ and GSP and Anderson Silva were number one, where I probably would have picked BJ Penn as my GOAT along with Fedor. Like, I did actually think this guy was unbelievable because, remember, eye test phenomenal, skill set insane. At the time, there were very few well-rounded fighters. This guy had it all. And then also, he could win at higher weight classes than he should be fighting at, and then he was a 2 weight class champion. Like, the guy had it all. He was a fucking phenomenal fighter. His hand speed was crazy. This guy was absolutely pro. The problem is, the reason why I'm going to have to go ham on this one is, he stayed around way too long when he was not very good anymore. And also, you have to understand the context of his era, because his resume just isn't as packed is the problem. Like, if you go here, he's lost 14 fights. He's only won 16, so you're already going to think, GOAT contender. But that's because if you go all the way back, remember, the nickname of BJ Penn is the Prodigy. Because when he was like a teenager, he became a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and then went and won like, whatever, like ADCC or whatever it is thing in like Abu Dhabi for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. That's why he's a phenom. And then you see, he comes straight into the UFC. His debut at MMA is in the UFC, and he is just winning fights. He debuts in the UFC. He wins fights. By the way, Carl Uno is no bum. He's fighting him in his 3rd fight and knocking him out. And then his 4th fight in the UFC and in MMA officially is a title fight for the UFC light heavyweight title in 2002. And he lost to Jens Pulver, who was a good fighter. And at the time, essentially like veteraned him at the time. He still was a very young fighter, BJ. Then he went away. Yeah, no one gives a fuck who Paul Creighton is. Matt Serra, by the way, was a guy who was a champion a weight class above. Remember, this is a guy who beat GSP later if you go up. So actually to win over him, he was no joke. He wasn't a true champion level fighter. Generally, even though he won, that was something of an upset. But he was a solid fight. He was a contender at one point in time. He has another fight with Carl Uno. He has a fight with Takanori Norigomi, who, by the way, was a very good fighter from Japan. One of the best at this weight class. Fabulous fighter over in the Japanese leagues. Again, well-rounded guy who can box, guy who can do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He actually subs him, which is a big deal. He has a fight with Matt Hughes. Again, this is the case, by the way. Notice where he's fighting Matt Hughes, though. Wait a minute. Won the UFC welterweight champion. So BJ Penn is a fighter who should be fighting at lightweight. That's his natural weight. And he not only won the UFC welterweight championship, a weight class above, but he did it over Matt Hughes. Do you know how fucking huge Matt Hughes is? Matt Hughes is one of those guys where, like, his neck looks like your thigh. Like, that's, it's bigger than your thigh, rather. That's how crazy jacked this guy is. This is a guy who should be fighting against people like GSP, not BJ Penn. So the idea you beat him, sub him, and take the belt at a high weight, that's why BJ Penn is a fucking legend. Oh, and by the way, do you want to know what else he did? Because he's just a warrior. While he was the champion, he then just got stripped because he had a contract dispute. Fucked off to Japan. And are you seeing these here? Goes and fights like Dwayne Ludwig, who made his more famous as a coach, and subbed him. Who really cares? But this is a Gracie that he beat. And then he fought Lyoto Machida, who, remember, years later becomes the light heavyweight champion of the UFC. He fought Lyoto Machida at fucking heavyweight in an open weight bout. And it was a decision. Machida did not even finish him. And go watch this fight. Like, this just shows you what a maniac BJ Penn is. Sadly, this is when he was in his physical prime, so he could do crazy shit like that, like a rock and roll star, just do what he wanted. Later on, this mentality to fight the bigger guy, actually, I do think cost him, first of all, a better placing on a list like this, but also potentially ruined his career, I actually think. After that, he comes back to the UFC, UFC welterweight, and he has a fight against GSP, when GSP's on his way to the title. And by the way, go watch this fight. Not only is it a mad underrated fight, but there are so many times I've watched this fight where either, first of all, it looks like BJ Penn is going to win the fight early. And there's times where I can see a way you could actually call this first fight a BJ Penn win. It's just that I also think when I watch it and I try to look at all factors, I think it's not unfair to say that GSP slightly edged it, which is why, if people don't know, when GSP became the champion and BJ Penn went down and became the lightweight champion, they did the super fight. One of the first true great super fights, aside from the higher weight classes, was this super fight at welterweight to see if BJ Penn could become a two-weight champion simultaneously. And even though now you watch GSP just absolutely body him, at the time people thought that was going to be very competitive. That's why famously BJ Penn said, I won't stop until you get dead, George, or whatever. So, okay, he went back, and then what happened was he'd already won the UFC. Go back a second. There you go. So he wins this one. He lost the one to GSP. Then he came and he fought Matt Hughes again, and this time Matt Hughes knocked him the fuck out. Matt Hughes is enormous, by the way. He then got his revenge on Jens Pulver, so that's quite cool. Back to lightweight here. He beat Joe Stevenson to win the lightweight championship. I don't think Joe Stevenson truly should be considered like an all-time contender at that weight class, so actually that one, it's kind of an all right win, but it's not truly elite. Sean Shirk was very good. I wonder why his muscles were so big, but even so, that's the iconic one that you remember was used from the intro where he did the flying knee. Then he had the super fight against GSP, which sadly he did get battered in, and it was right for them to throw the towel on that. He was getting his fucking head smashed in. I do think, I'll just say this, I wish there weren't so many fucking cheaters in this sport. I do think it is mega sus if you look into it around that era and look at the interviews with people like BJ Penn and Matt Hughes. It does seem suspiciously like GSP does magically seem to need a lot of that fucking Vaseline when he's backstage. It does seem to come through his pores, and it does seem impossible to just wrap up or use your very flexible limbs on like BJ Penn has. Magically, suddenly the ground game doesn't work from the back. I don't like that, being as GSP already maybe is the best wrestler ever in UFC in terms of MMA wrestling. I don't like the idea you get that edge. But back at lightweight, he beats Kenny Florian, who at the time was a true contender. He beat him solidly. Sanchez probably never should have been there, but we all know he's just money in fights. Like, people just love watching him rock 'em, sock 'em robots. So unsurprisingly, BJ beat the fuck out of him. Then there was the infamous famous losses to Frankie Edgar. The first one is right on the line. I can, again, score this for both people. I could see it being Frankie's. I could see it being BJ's. So I didn't hate the idea Frankie slightly edged it. This is one of the first fights, if you don't know, where people started to argue, like, maybe you shouldn't be able to just edge the champion. Maybe you should have to show it, that you've got to properly beat the champion to be the champion. I think it's fine to still have judging, etc. The rematch, though, Frankie Edgar just conclusively beats him in this one. This was actually quite good. And sadly, this is basically where BJ decides, even though he's only 15-7 at this point, with some losses to some people who are going to be Hall of Famers mostly, this is where he decides to essentially ruin his career, because now he just keeps fighting at a higher level stupidly for the next, 8 years. So you go here, he goes up a weight class to fight Matt Hughes in a rubber match, and he famously beats him very quickly. Okay, that was awesome. Matt Hughes was at the end of his career, by the way. Then he fought John Fitch, and famously, what's interesting about this match is it's ruled a draw, but in the spirit of how a fight works, John Fitch is dominating him at the end of the fight. And if you look at how you score a fight, I don't think a draw's unfair, actually. Because even though BJ was winning like the first round, John Fitch definitely won the third round, and by like a decent margin. So as a result, I don't hate it being a draw. It maybe even should have been edged to John Fitch. But again, John Fitch is like GSP. You shouldn't even be fighting someone who's at that size and weight class and whose whole strength is fucking wrestling and ground and pound. Then he has his fight with Nick Diaz when Nick Diaz was really hot from his time over in Strikeforce. The problem with this one is, first round of the fight is a banger. It's an awesome boxing match. The rest of the fight is BJ Penn getting his face repeatedly fucked up by Nick Diaz, and Nick Diaz conclusively beat him up in this fight. And this was the beginning of the end for BJ Penn as like the best fighter in his weight class, or one of the best in the world, or pound for pound king, all that shit. Because after this, it's bad enough you're fighting GSP. It's bad enough you're fighting fucking John Fitch. Now you're fighting fucking Rory McDonald. Another person, too big, too young, like this is the wrong weight class. He absolutely fucked BJ Penn up in this fight. Then we had a third match against Frankie Edgar, which never should have happened. This was an absolute joke of a fight. BJ Penn looked like an idiot, and this one was a dog shit fight. Then he was allowed to fight Yair Rodriguez. By the way, at least some of these names, Yair Rodriguez obviously went on to be a very competitive fighter, quite a skilled fighter. Unsurprisingly, he got knocked the fuck out. Then he fought Dennis Silva, who at this point in time, it's amazing he's even still in the UFC, loses a decision to him, looks crap. He gets subbed by Ryan Hall, even fucking Clay Guida. Clay Guida hadn't been relevant for years, and he's beaten you in a decision. I get why the UFC and Dana wanted to keep giving fights to BJ Penn. It helps build other people's resumes. He's still a fan favourite. There's the Hawaiian component. He's won you a lot of fights and had a lot of exciting fights at higher weight classes. You want to give him more chances. But man alive, these last few years, everything after the Nick Diaz fight is just sadder and sadder and sadder progressively. It's diminishing returns every fight on out. Meanwhile, before that, what a legendary run of how many great fights he had here. What a great resume. This is a guy where what he did was excellent, but he was this close to doing some really special things, like beating GSP once, or maybe actually like having the more championships. Obviously, he had loads of title fights. He could have won the welterweight belt a couple more times. He could have had the lightweight belt 1 or 2 more times. He didn't ever have to leave and go and have those crazy fights in Japan. He could have just stayed lightweight his whole career and tried to beat like the Anderson Silva GSP of his division and just take the occasional fight up in a higher weight class for whatever reason, or do super fights. Like, I actually think to some degree also BJ did suffer from the fact that the smaller weight classes back in his day, he was in the smallest one, and that itself didn't even exist initially. So as a result, you're in a world where it's like you almost feel like you have to fight in a higher weight class to fight bigger names, to get a bigger payday, to get more fanfare. And at the time, because he was a fantastic, well-rounded fighter, and supposedly he was like the fastest, I don't know, reaction time or whatever of any fighter in the UFC. I think that's what like John Danaher said to GSP. As a result, he used to have an edge where he thought he could win against those people. Then, when his speed went a little bit down, when he wasn't getting as good shape anymore, he wasn't as motivated, then he got sad. Then he just got sad because this guy was a really special fighter. So then we're going to go to Daniel Cormier. Now, I will say, this is a guy where people meme on him because we all know, obviously, he lost to Jon Jones. And if Jon Jones is on your list, well, Jon Jones directly beat the guy twice and definitely did beat him. And so how could Daniel Cormier be the GOAT if someone in his own weight class not only beat him, I don't care about the drug thing, but also is just a better fighter at that weight class? But the problem is this. Everything outside of the Jon Jones fights demands that Daniel Cormier be put onto this list. He's actually better than some of the names I've listed before, even if his case at being the GOAT might not be as good as like some of the names that I've mentioned before. So if you go down, we're not going to count things he did in wrestling. Like, I don't count that as part of mixed martial arts. You have to actually be in the sport mixed martial arts. But you go and look at this guy's record. It's fantastic. So if you go back to here, realistically, it's only in Strikeforce that people got interested in this guy, right? Jeff Monson's a veteran. but he's a hard guy. So he beats him early on. This is Bigfoot. If you remember the guy with a giant chin, this was a very legit fighter. This is the guy who'd beaten Fedor. He beats him, knocks him out. He beat Josh Barnett, who was still a dangerous heavyweight. There's a reason he went back to the UFC. Very well-rounded skill set. Also a veteran fighter. Beat him in a decision. This is when you knew Cormier was dangerous, because you could already see he was a bit like Fedor. He's like an undersized guy. Obviously, his skill more on the wrestling side than the boxing side, but actually even his like stand-up was pretty legit at this time. So you knew he was going to come to the UFC. He comes over to the UFC, straight up beats Frank Mir out the gate. Frank Mir, by the way, one of the best heavyweights of all time at this point in time. Beats Roy Nelson, who's dangerous. We all know he's knocked loads of people out, and he's a black belt himself in jiu-jitsu. Who cares about Pat Cummings? We'll forget that one. That's when he went down to light heavyweight. Then at light heavyweight, he beats Dan Henderson, one of the best fighters of all time. Admittedly, Dan Henderson probably was older than fucking God at this point in time. But even so, it's not an easy guy to finish. And you have rear naked choke finished this guy. Then you have the first fight against Jon Jones. It's a close fight, but famously, Jon Jones does look better than him, does take over in the fight, is the better fighter. You fight Anthony Johnson. Obviously, if anything, he's actually someone where, I mean, this was Rumble Johnson, remember? A very dangerous fighter, but famously, obviously, early in the fight when he could do the Rumble sort of rush move. He beat him. By the way, that was a top contender. That was a very dangerous fighter. He beat Gustafsson. Obviously, we remember what he did to Jon Jones. He beat him in a split decision. This is all legit stuff. A lot of people, sometimes myself, in fact, I sometimes do think Gustafsson beat Jones, but at the same time, that spinning elbow did do a lot from the scorecard. I don't know. There's times I do think Gustafsson beat Jones. So to be fair, Daniel Cormier beat Gustafsson. Then he had a fight against Anderson Silva. Now, this is obviously, no one really cares about that period in Anderson Silva's career. This is the part where he's just taking fights for money and for fun. It doesn't feel like it's the same Anderson Silva who was the murderer at middleweight, right? Then you go, he had another Rumble Johnson fight, beat him again. I mean, you're clearing out the division here. These are all the contenders you're beating. Then you fought Jon Jones. This one is sad. Everyone's so unfair about this fight. Because let's be real. Until the moment Jon Jones turns the fight and then ends the fight, Daniel Cormier is winning this fight. Like, it's actually looking amazing. Like, if you're Daniel Cormier, you could imagine, you think it's like you're in a dream. The first part of the fight's going awesome. You've hyped yourself that the other one was a bullshit. Oh, it was years earlier. Now you've learned what you learned. There was a point in time where it looked like he was going to win this. Now, I know it technically he did because it was a no contest because Jon Jones tested positive for whatever. I don't care about that. Jon Jones did beat him in this fight, let's be real. Unless we're just going to take all cheaters and wipe their record, that he won the fight. So, okay, the problem now is, a lot of people think Jon Jones is the GOAT, and especially of that light heavyweight weight class. And you've lost twice to him, straight up, clearly, in front of all of our eyes. So you're going to have a hard time being the GOAT of MMA and your weight class. But after that, he goes to beats this guy, Wazdemir, or whatever. Beats him, okay. Because obviously he got to keep the belt because Jon Jones had it stripped because Jon Jones was doing Jon Jones shit. Then he went to heavyweight. Remember, he was still the UFC lightweight champion at this point in time. He had to vacate the title afterwards. He went up to heavyweight, which again, he's undersized for. He beat St-Pierre Miocic, who, by the way, might be the best UFC heavyweight of what? The last 10, 15 years, a fabulous fighter. Some people would say he should be on this GOAT list. I just didn't put him on because in general, I think only Fedor deserves to be on out of the heavyweights. St-Pierre Miocic, to beat him and to become the heavyweight champion, that was legit. Now, I get the problem then is the push was, he's the GOAT, and if he beats Miocic again, he's definitely the GOAT. And that was the narrative of the last two Miocic fights. Now, that wouldn't have made him the GOAT for me, but it would have been very impressive. That's another very big name to win. Beat Derek Lewis. We all know Derek Lewis, like, he subbed him. Most people couldn't even hold Derek Lewis down. He'd just get up and he's dangerous. He knocks you out. Now, the last two fights with Miocic, yeah, sad, because the TKO is fine. Miocic deserves a win if anything. He's all-time great heavyweight. The last one, though, this is the one that got away. You can look at the Jon Jones fights, but even if we ignore them for a second, if he wins this one and again gets the heavyweight title and then retires as a heavyweight champion after being a lightweight champion, clearing out the whole division, beating everyone except Jon Jones, and before in Strikeforce he was beating a bunch of top heavyweights, that would be extremely impressive. At that point in time, essentially, you've beaten everyone you can at heavyweight and everyone except Jon Jones at light heavyweight. Like, that's a phenomenal record. In that world, then I would say this. Couldn't he be the second greatest fighter of all time? Maybe only Jon Jones can beat him. Like, I actually think you have to give Daniel Cormier his credit. He has a phenomenal resume with some massive names, and he really did do a lot of work clearing out contenders while Jon Jones sat there, did fuck all. They came back and beat Daniel Cormier himself, right? So I think actually underrated to some degree, even though, yes, he didn't get the 2 or 3 big wins he needed to get to the top of this list. Then we have Matt Hughes. Now, anyone who's going to be like, lol, what's he doing? Oh, it's a boomer pick, isn't he? Who cares about him? No, Matt Hughes was a monster. This was a guy in the welterweight division who nobody wants to fight. He could fuck you up in so many ways. And he's nasty. You ever heard the guy talk? He had a horrible personality. If you ever hear the story about him and his brothers and stuff, they sound like arseholes, mate. They sound like every fucking high school bully arsehole you never want to be around. But I'll tell you what, but you're fucking brilliant at fighting as a result. So you go back, this is a really old school fighter. Look, he's fighting in not only the 90s, all the way back, including against Dennis Hallman. Remember the guy who had those ridiculous shots in the UFC? They got like Speedos that got pissed off. Back in 1998, he's fighting against Matt Hughes. So, okay, let's go up. We don't care about some of these as much, but we're going to go up. Okay, UFC. We're already into the UFC now. UFC back in 1999, so it's early days. Lots of these people, obviously, he's a wrestler, so you're just used to fighting a bazillion people. He's winning a lot of fights. It's just these aren't people that have like actual entries. Carlos Newton was a dangerous fighter, people might know. You have a couple of fights against him, beats him both times. You go up, Sean Shirk, like I said, when he fought against BJ Penn, very legit fighter. Frank Trigg was somewhat of a journeyman, but he was a decent enough fighter. He lost to BJ Penn. BJ Penn is one of the absolute best fighters ever, and at this point looked like a potential GOAT himself. He beat GSP. Matt Hughes beat GSP. A lot of people are going to tell me he's the GOAT of MMA. Well, you know what? This guy beat GSP with a fucking submission. That's pretty legit. And that's how he won the UFC welterweight championship. He'd already been the welterweight champion before, but then he lost to BJ Penn. Look how many times he defended it, by the way. All these defenses. Then he lost it. Then he wins it back via GSP. Then he beats Frank Trigg, Joe Riggs. These are all just all right fighters. Royce Gracie, solid fighter, but again, not the best. Beats BJ Penn for revenge, defends the title. Then he loses the welterweight championship to who? John St-Pierre. He then lost again to GSP. GSP is going to be in most people's top three, if not the GOAT of MMA. You keep going up, beat Matt Serra, lost to Thiago Alves. Thiago Alves was a monster, by the way. This guy really nasty, not surprised he knocked him out. And this is way later in your career. This is in 2008. You were fighting in 1998, for fuck's sake. You look at the end of his career, okay, he had a couple of wins over people who were like journeymen. Then he lost to BJ Penn in one of the last few good wins of BJ Penn. He lost to Josh Koscheck, who, by the way, around this time went on to be like a fucking championship contender himself a bunch of times and was quite a skilled... He was a good wrestler with knockout power, and he was much younger than Matt Hughes, I think, at the time. So, again, actually a very strong resume. His problem is, obviously, the 2000s and 90s stuff. Some of those names either don't have listings, just aren't as relevant, and obviously MMA wasn't as big back then. So, unfortunately, he didn't get to have the GSP-esque career that GSP had got to have later. He didn't quite catch that wave, but I mean, you just look at who he's beat, look at who he's fought. This guy also, eye test checks out like a motherfucker when we're talking about Matt Hughes, by the way. Then we go to Randy Couture. Now, this is a guy, I can tell you straight up, was once upon a time being talked about as the GOAT, just the overall GOAT. Now, I'll get to where in a second. So, for someone like Matt Hughes, he was considered maybe he's the GOAT of welterweight, when he's just winning and having these streaks, and he's beating BJ Penn, he's beating GSP, he's beating all these people ahead of him. Randy Couture was a champion at light heavyweight, so already a big deal right there. And then he came back later as an old-ass guy, like 39 or 40 or something, and won over the heavyweight champion and became the heavyweight champion of the UFC. So this guy, at this point in time, everyone was like, holy shit, it's one of the few two-weight class champions that they've ever had, especially at that point in time. They might even have been the first. Everyone at the time was like, maybe this is the GOAT. That's why at the time, the fight actually was to have Fedor come from Pride and fight Randy Couture. That's the biggest fight that everyone wanted in MMA at that time. So let's go down. The problem Randy Couture has is this. He was already donkey's years old before the UFC ever got big. So he already, luckily that means a lot of the wear and tear was in different sports like wrestling, but it means that actually he was able to fight later in his career because the actual MMA part of his career officially was later on in his life. He was already maybe in his 30s or something by the time he started. So if we go all the way back, he's fighting all the way back here in early UFCs. He wins the UFC heavyweight tournament. He beats Vitor Belfort in the Eliminator, and he beats Maurice Smith, who most of you won't know, kickboxer, to win the UFC Heavyweight Championship in 1997. Now, if you go up, these are all fighters you would know about. That's why they all have listings. They've all fought in UFC and Pride. Pedro Hizzo was a veteran of the UFC. You had people like Randleman was a monster in Pride in the UFC. What a fucking beast physically. This is the guy that famously did the slam on Fedor, that Fedor quickly spun out of and did the Kimura off. You have a bunch of fighters that are over in Japan. You have Overeem's brother. A lot of people won't know that his brother was actually at one point in time a skilled fighter. Jeremy Horn was a submission specialist, but look, Randy Couture's just beating him in the decision. You have the odd loss here and there, like look, some of these to some Japanese fighters early on back in the day. Vale Tudo, it's essentially MMA. It's a sort of like no rules type fighting back then. So you go up, we've already just got to the 2000s here. So you have a bunch of wins there. You lose to Josh Barnett. Josh Barnett at the time was a young stud. And Josh Barnett, by the way, has a fantastically well-rounded MMA game. Was a very, very strong. It's only people like Fedor and maybe like Crow Corp or something. These are the only people that stopped Josh Barnett being like a Pride champion as well as a UFC champion. Then you have some other people here. Listen, you can get knocked out by someone like that. This guy was actually a monster. Then he beats Chuck Liddell to win the light heavyweight. Right? Chuck Liddell at the time wasn't losing to anyone. Chuck Liddell was a monster. Until he lost his chin, he was one of the scariest fighters to ever face. And what happened? While Tito was potentially docking Chuck, along came fucking Randy Couture because he's a gamer, just fought him, knocked him out and took the belt. Then what did he do? Well, since Tito Ortiz won't fight Chuck Liddell, I've just beaten Chuck Liddell, so I'll go fight you, Tito. Famously, he not only beat him, and when this is decision unanimous, he comprehensively beat this guy, even though it was the decision. This is the fight, if you remember, where he's literally holding Tito, who's massive, and just patting him on his ass like that, because he's got all the wrestling strength and that old man strength. Then he had his loss against Vitor Belfort, who knocked him out, right? Okay, by the way, this is the Vitor Belfort who looked like something out of a Marvel comics from the 90s. That's ridiculous, this era of what they allowed these guys to do. Then he came back, though, and beat him. Comes back, he fights him twice here, beats him. Then you have, although this is not the later Vitor who's really old, but again, Vitor Belfort always looked ridiculous to me. Then you have Chuck Liddell got his revenge on him. Chuck Liddell was, in theory, like the king of that division. You won't know this guy, he fought him a few times. Then he went back to heavyweight, right? Tim Sylvia was the champion at the time of heavyweight. By the way, even though Tim Sylvia, not too long afterwards, lost to Fedor, at the time, people like Dana White used to say Fedor wasn't even that good and Pride was overrated and the UFC had the best heavyweights. And then people like Tim Sylvia and Andrei Arlovsky, who were champions in the UFC at one point in time, then later went and did exhibition fights against Fedor and were beaten by Fedor comprehensively. And as a result, Dana White looked silly. When Tim Sylvia lost this fight to Randy Couture, it's the one that begins with Randy Couture just doing that crazy out of the nowhere move and just attacking him. Like, that's when you're just like, holy shit, can this guy ever lose? Is this guy, I mean, they used to call him Captain America. Is this guy like the protagonist of MMA? This is crazy. Then he had a fight against Gonzaga, who at the time, if you remember, had knocked the fuck out of Krokop with that crazy kick where he was all fucked up and wrecked his leg when he was, at the time, Krokop just come from Pride and was a killer. So at the time, people were scared of Gonzaga. Doesn't matter. He takes care of him. Now he loses to Brock Lesnar. This was where you realise Brock Lesnar is an absolute physical specimen. Because even though he didn't actually have that great skills, just like against Frank Mir, he just uses his physical presence to just dominate Randy Couture. Like, it makes sense that Randy Couture loses. Then he had like a legacy fight. He's much older at this point in time with Nogueira. These were two of the all-time greats, obviously. That was just a good boxing match. They were both past their prime. He beat Brandon Vera, who was considered like an up-and-comer with promise. He beat Mark Coleman, who was mega old at this point in time. They probably never should have allowed that fight to take place. He beat James Toney just because it was one of those fights where an old-ass boxer, this is like a precursor to what happens now with like theory-relevant boxers. But this is where someone who's already mega old decided to I could fight y'all MMA guy, and then just got immediately beaten very, very easily by Randy Couture. And then his last fight was the famous front kick knockout where Lyoto Machida did like a flying version of what Anderson Silva did to Vitor Belfort, which knocked him the fuck out with the front kick. And that was the end of his career. Now, here's the thing. When you look at the wins and losses, there's a lot of losses here, you'll notice, first of all, for Randy Couture. And he is a massive gamer. He's willing to just fight anyone, anywhere. And he has a lot of fights against people who are quite dangerous. The problem is, one, his era means, aside from the Chuck Liddells and Tito Ortiz, he doesn't have as many of the top names. He has the Josh Barnetts, etc. Some of them have been lost to history, though, and a lot of them, you'll notice, don't make this list, which is a bit of a problem. But when you look at the fact he was a two-weight champion, he actually was able to beat, at time, strong fighters in those divisions like Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, Tim Sylvia. These aren't joke fights. It's just they're not quite as good as like the likes of Fedor, GSP, and Silva. So he deserves to be mentioned, but he does not get to be a GOAT, Randy Couture. And the what if for him is, what if he'd been 25 when MMA had gotten big and he hadn't already been essentially someone who'd already had a sporting career? Then we have got Kamaru Usman, who, I mean, for people who don't know, supposedly he was called Marty at one point in time, wasn't he? But he's done that thing where they're going with the traditional name. Now, this is a guy where I get it. He's not that great on the mic. And when he was a champion, he did come off quite poorly. He came off like he had arrogance, but not in a cool way, if you know what I mean. And so unfortunately, a lot of people, when he was talking like, and then if I win this fight, maybe I just retire. He didn't vibe with a lot of people. But I have to say, one, I actually think his personality's come off a lot better since he's lost, because he's actually been quite magnanimous and quite reflective, and I'd say quite genuine and authentic in those losses. Ever since he knocked Masvidal the fuck out, he definitely has gotten a little bit spicy. I actually thought someone was better to Leon Edwards was even good. The problem you have in Kamaru Usman is, one, people don't like you. Two, you had a lot of decision fights, so people are going to say, yeah, they're in. And then thirdly, because you've now lost 2 out of 3 to Leon Edwards, they're going to do that thing they do with Adesanya, where they're like, lol, you lost, who cares? You can't possibly be the best. But as usual, context is king, isn't it? So if we go all the way back here, obviously, we only care around the time he gets to the UFC. So around the time he gets to the UFC, you have a very early fight with Leon Edwards, who's now the champion, has been the champion and a championship contender for a number of years. And he wins this one by decision. By the way, there's a world where he could have won all 3 Leon Edwards fights by decision, and you can make an argument he maybe should have won 2 of the 3. I would say the last one, maybe I would say Leon Edwards should win, but actually, and even then he had a fucking false hold when there was an almost guaranteed takedown when Kamaru Usman was coming on strong. The second one, Usman's just winning that fight, and then the flash knockout at the end of the fight, which quite frankly looked like a Hail Mary comes. So I even think people are quite unfair with the losses. So you get a win over Leon Edwards here. Then you have this one, who really cares about these ones, right? He beat Sean Strickland way back in 2017. I will say, Sean Strickland now is a champion, obviously in a different weight class. But to be fair, this was back when no one gave a shit about Sean Strickland. People didn't even think Sean Strickland was good until he just won this championship. So that one looks a bit better on paper than it is. You have, if you keep going up, some of these names aren't so great, but you have Damian Maia here. Damian Maia is a phenomenal BJJ fighter. That just shows your wrestling pedigree if you can beat Damian Maia. Fantastic fighter. Rafael Dos Anjos, a very dangerous all-round fighter, even though maybe he lost a bit of his nerve in the latter fights, maybe after Tony Ferguson beat him. You beat him by decision. Fantastic fight. Then you beat Tyron Woodley, who himself, remember, was on a streak of defending the belt and has similar skill set on paper to Usman. Usman outclassed him. Usman really showed that, Usman had phenomenal fighting game in terms of his wrestling's fabulous, his wrestling defense is great, and then he's also pretty solid on the feet, even though he's not a knockout artist at this point in time. Then you have the fight against Colby Covington, the first fight, great fight by the way, banger back and forth, and you do break the guy's jaw, so you get to win that one. Then you have the first Masvidal fight, which is a bit whatever, but you did win it. The Gilbert Burns fight, Gilbert Burns at time had some heat. I actually think it was a little bit overrated, but you did knock him the fuck out. Then there was obviously that crazy, knockout of Masvidal, which was mega. At this point in time, you think this guy, surely he's one of the best fighters ever, Usman. Who's even going to beat him? At the time, we thought maybe Colby Covington can. Fantastic second fight. But I do think you have to edge it to Usman overall, even though I think Colby Covington held his own. It was a fabulous fight. Whether, by the way, this is why I sort of low-key hope Covington just beats Edwards and becomes a champion. Because at some point, whether it's for the belt or not, we need a third fight. Even if Usman wins it, these were fantastic matches. It's not just about wins and losses. Then he obviously has the Leon Edwards saga. So like I say, he has the one where he gets knocked out. He's just winning that fight. He just was. Then you have the one where it was in the UK. This was a really close fight and he was doing quite well towards the end. Like I say, to me, I know he got a point taken off, but I actually really think if Leon Edwards gets taken down towards the end of that fight, that might just be the decision win for Usman at that point in time. It looked like he would have ground and pound controlled him and he could have just straight up won. So I actually think even some of the losses are mega overplayed. Now, the Khamzat Chimaev one is different because one, he's gone to a different weight class on short notice, so you don't quite count those fully, they have an asterisk. And then two, he actually did look like towards the end of that fight, apparently he had the choice and he chose it to be 3 rounds instead of 5. He should have chosen 5. I'll tell you right now, if he could have taken Chimaev to the deep waters, I think he could have won this fight. He looked like he was coming on strong. Now everyone's going to go, yeah, but Chimaev broke his hand. First of all, who knows if any of that shit's true? Yeah, it could be. But you know what? I also think he gasses. I also think you can't go up that pace as a massive guy for 5 whole rounds. I'd like to see him actually be forced to do it. So I actually think Usman's problem mainly is that if you just go back to the championship part here, right? Masvidal got a bit of hype off the Till fight and was slightly overrated. Before that, there's a reason. He was Journeyman George. That's who he was. His career was already done. He was never going to be a champion. So the fact he fought him twice, I mean, that second one's great for the KO, He shouldn't really be fighting him twice. It's not really that legit in my opinion. Like, Masvidal's a contender, but he was never actually championship material for me. The Covington fights are great, so you win those. That's really big. Beating Woodley and Dos Anjos, these are all-time great fighters. Damian Maia's an all-time great. These are some pretty good wins to have. Unfortunately, you did lose twice to Leon Edwards. One win extra there would help. And Chimaev might yet end up going on to be an all-time great, which case you'll pump your resume up a bit. So I actually do think, bear in mind, he's only lost 4 times. I can make solid excuses for 2 of them, and one of the third ones was one where it was just essentially short notice at a different weight class. So I do think Usman's actually underrated in these discussions. I think he was fantastic. The problem is he had some title defenses against people that maybe aren't all-time greats, and he had a lot of boring decision wins. And this is the thing I want to point out. Even though now recency bias is, who cares about him? He did clean out his division. He cleaned it out to the extent they were letting Covington and Masvidal just have second cracks at him because he was just beating everyone else convincingly, some of them knocking out and submitting. So I actually do think there's a world where he could have won the Edwards fight all 3 times. I think he's actually underrated. Like, if it wasn't for the fact, for me, the eye test isn't as good and the raw, like, overall the dominance in terms of winning fights is great, but in terms of how you dominate fights isn't quite as good as some of the other names on this list. So he didn't get to be in the elite category towards the end, which we're not too far from. Oh, Thorin, what have you done? You must have put the list wrong, mate. This should be in the last part where you're going to pick from who the GOAT. No, I'm not. No. In fact, some of the names I've already gone through are better than this guy. But wait, Thorin, he's my GOAT. He is the GOAT of MMA. He never lost. Yeah, and that's the problem. He didn't actually give us a fair shake at this. Now, part of that's the problem of the UFC, that because he was considered a boring wrestling fighter who might win by decision, there was a lot of his wins. He spent way too long fighting journeymen and bums and nobodies, as I'll show you now. Now, I'll probably do a whole video separately about why Khabib isn't the GOAT, but it's quite simple to say. His resume is incredibly lacking compared to some of these names, especially the ones that are still to come. Like, this is a guy where you have to remember he didn't get to the championship level till very late in his career. And then actually a bunch of hijinks means he missed 2 proper title fights at least. So you go all the way back here. Like, he's fighting in the 2000s, right? We don't care about all these Eastern European. No one gives a flying fuck. So you keep going up. We still don't care yet. By the way, he is already, before we get to the UFC, 16-0. So when you tell me, Darren, he is 29-0, yeah, go ahead and take 16 of those off. So he can be 13-0. Notice how 13-0 doesn't sound that correct. That doesn't sound like the instant GOAT of MMA, does it? Then we have to ask, who did you fight? Because who the fuck are these people? No one cares. No one cares about these wins here. They're against nobodies. Nobody gives a flying fuck. So then he gets to the UFC, and the problem, as you can see, is until he gets to Dos Anjos, he's just fighting people who just aren't that great. Like, they're all right fighters. Like, we all know Gleison Tibau, yeah, he was a solid enough fighter. We all know Thiago Tavares was all right. We know Javier Dos Anjos is obviously a champion. That's when it starts to get good. The problem is, he's already 22-0. Javier Dos Anjos, we're not that far from the end, guys. So he fights Javier Dos Anjos, championship level fighter. Who gives a shit about Daryl Horscher at catchweight? I think this might even have been, by the way, Khabib that missed weight on this one. Then he fights Michael Johnson, who famously, I always loved that line, that he's like I think the line is like he's the worst good fighter or something, because the famous thing about Michael Johnson is his actual skill set is he actually has come so close to knocking out or otherwise beating great fighters, and himself being one of the best in the world. But then he can also not only lose to lesser people, but then he'll sometimes somehow find a way to lose that fight that he's winning against a really good person. So this is a guy I always thought was going to be a fucking murderer, but he just never quite made it at the full level of the UFC. This is one of the ones, though, you remember when he was talking to Michael, you must quit, you got to give up now, you cannot keep going. And that was gangster, so everyone remembers he beat him, right? The problem is, you're already 24-0 by the time you beat him. There's only 5 fights to go, and you're making this guy the GOAT. Then after that, he fights Edson Barbosa. Now, we know that's a dangerous fighter, but it's not someone who's even close to getting on this list. Guys, we've only got 4 fights to go. Then he fights Al Iaquinta. Now, Al Iaquinta's like a journeyman / above average fighter in the UFC. And actually, by the way, on short notice, did a very admirable job in this fight. That's why it was a decision. By the way, there's another thing. Why so many decisions? Why decisions against Gleison Tibau, against Abel Trujillo, against Pat Healy, against Rafael Dos Anjos, against Edson Barbosa, You're telling me this guy's the GOAT? The most dominant ever? These aren't even names, most of them, aside from Dos Anjos, that would be even considered in a great conversation, and he's just decisioning them. Because that's the other thing. You're looking at the best fights and thinking, like, he's a murderer, he'd kill anyone. Maybe he would if he kept fighting, but he didn't keep fighting. That's the saddest part. He quit right at his peak, at the zenith of his career, and his opportunities and his skill set is when he quit. Now, you can say, yeah, but he quit because of his father and because of the promise. That's irrelevant to a discussion about who the greatest fighter of all time is. You don't get to go, oh, well, that case gives him 10 extra wins and just imagine that he beat a load of other people he didn't fight. No, that doesn't get to happen. So then you go up, and why was he fighting Al Iaquinta, right? To win the UFC lightweight championship. Because at the time, I think off the top of my head, this was one of the Tony Ferguson pullouts. Tony Ferguson and him were supposed to fight like 5 times. And I think like Khabib fucked up 2 and Tony fucked up 3 or something like that. By the way, he needed that fight. That was one where if he'd have fought Tony once or twice and gotten the win, that was another big name who'd won a lot of fights and they were both on that crazy win streak collision course. That would have been the defining legacy fight of Khabib's career. And if he completely dominates Tony before Tony starts to show all these problems, he gets like Conquer style a lot of the hype that Tony had. And then I actually think now you're starting to get a pretty spicy resume going. But he didn't. He fought Al Iaquinta. It was a decision. Then he fought Conor McGregor, who'd been off for years, fucking off fighting Floyd Mayweather in boxing, comes back without even like a tune-up. And by the way, Conor McGregor was way more competitive in this fight than people give him credit for. You go and watch some of these rounds, like, they're not that dominant. Now, there are dominant rounds in it, and the way the fight ends is incredibly dominant. Like, he basically just hurts Conor McGregor. Yeah, that's all cool. We all know the drama around it and the fight after the fight. No, but actually, this is a great win in terms of the resume. But one, was this like best Conor McGregor ever? I don't know. He looked a little bit ring rust to me, a little bit rusty in the ring. And then secondly, I actually think people do exaggerate the idea that he could just beat him from the beginning of the bell to the end of it. No, he didn't. Then he fought Poirier. Now, to be fair, this one looked awesome. This is a great opponent to beat against. It's a champion himself, a championship fighter at least. Obviously, Khabib stopped him being undisputed. And he was a very well-rounded fighter. He went for everything he could. This was one of those ones where Khabib really put the pace on him. And then his last fight ever was obviously Justin Gaethje, where Gaethje did look a bit gun-shy and did actually, quite frankly, seem a bit too pally. He didn't look like the Gaethje that was just banging against some of the other people. That was a little bit of a shame. Still finished him. A very dominant submission. Looked like he could have done it any time he wanted in terms of how he submitted him. I suppose he could have broken his arm and he chose instead to triangle choke him and just make him tap. I actually think, yeah, in the fights that he was in, he was good. Some of them he was very good. His potential looked crazy. I would love to have seen from 2020 another 5 Khabib fights. I want to see him fight again against like Dustin Poirier, or I want to see him fight Charles Oliveira or Makhachev or any of these guys. We never get to see it, unfortunately. Volkanovski. Wouldn't these all be amazing fights to help his career? So the real problem with Khabib, I might do it one time, is I think people just massively underestimate. I could go individually more. I think his resume is mad oversexed. It's just because he never lost, and when he would win, it would look really scary. He retired at the perfect time to keep the mystique as perfect as he can. People like Anderson Silva kept going. People like BJ Penn kept going. People like GSP you just haven't seen in too long, so you forget how dominant they were. This guy retired at the perfect time to make every fanboy think he'd never lose. But I think he would have, and he's not ever going to prove me wrong, apparently, is he? Then we've got Israel Adesanya. So the same reason as I have to put Usman on, I have to put Adesanya on as well. But what about Aldo Pereira? Let's just get into this, shall we? Look at this guy's fucking record, boys. Right. So we'll go all the way back here. So he's having these fights against who cares over here. Comes into, this isn't the UFC, it's the AFC. But if you remember, Melvin Guillard was a guy who was a dangerous striker who, look at this, right? In 2011, it says there, was number 9 ranked. This is a guy who was really fast. If you remember, he had like a lot of like physical gifts. He just never could get it together with his head. So he beats him. Okay, not bad. Then you get in the UFC. You're already beating people. You get performance of the night. Look at these. Performance of the night. Performance of the night. Some of these are KOs. Even the decisions are nice fights. Like, we all know these people. Who doesn't know Derek Brunson, Brad Tavares? We know all these people. He has the fight against Anderson Silva. Look, Anderson Silva's past his prime. This is more of an exhibition. It really was like some anime shit. It's a fabulous technical fight, even though, yes, there's not that many actual like crazy shots landed. He fights Kevin Gastelum to win the championship. Kevin Gastelum is an underrated fighter. He's proof that you can't judge a book by its cover, and that the skill sets that make you win in MMA aren't just like hardest puncher, craziest thing, like, wow, look what a physical specimen. Kevin Gastelum looks like fucking the third Mario brother, and he still was a fabulous UFC fighter who could always overperform. It's clearly had some issues making weight, but like was just like a mad underrated fighter to some degree. Wins the championship off him, then he beats Robert Whittaker. Robert Whittaker has helped make that part of the resume look better and better and better because Robert Whittaker's a stud in this division. He beat Yoel Romero. Yoel Romero was a fucking killer. Let's not fuck around on that one. Yoel Romero could knock out a lot of people. And quite frankly, I'm not surprised that was the decision. Feels like it's impossible to knock him out. He just has a crazy, crazy fucking chin. Then he beat Paulo Costa. We all know he's a dangerous guy, even though he's probably more contender level than champion. He then went up and tried to do the super fight and win the light heavyweight championship. Now, he didn't win that one, and he actually convincingly didn't. That sort of showed a little bit of his hubris, but I appreciate the ambition to go for it. He came back down and just started racking up wins again. Like Cannonier, a lot of people thought he was scary. Whittaker was supposed to be ready for the return. I actually do think, by the way, that was a very close fight. I can see why Whittaker in his mind thinks he won. I actually would disagree because of octagon control, but I do think it was a close fight, and those are two all-time great fighters. Then he had the Pereira saga, his own version of the Leon Edwards one. Now, what's interesting here is this. Here's where people are whack when it comes to this particular dynamic. So they fought 4 times in total, right? Because they fought twice in kickboxing and twice in UFC. Now, if you go watch the kickboxing ones, one of those is quite similar to the UFC. Adesanya looks like he's winning and about to win, and Pereira just survives and then wins. And then, yes, there's a straight up like KO that Pereira just clearly wins. So then we come to the two in the UFC. The first one, this sounds familiar. Adesanya is winning the fight, and then Pereira knocks him out of nowhere, which is when everyone went mad because Pereira was 3-0. Then you come back, it's a similar setup. It looks like Pereira's starting to land, and then Adesanya knocks him out with a crazy counter that he clearly was looking for and was part of his game plan. My problem with that is this. Just like on the Leon Edwards one, where you could have actually been 3-0 against Leon Edwards, there's a very real world where Adesanya could be 3-1 against Pereira. But instead, Pereira's 3-1 against him. Now, by the way, as he's showing you, Pereira is a fucking specimen. This guy is a beast. He himself, by the way, if he keeps fighting in the UFC, could go down on this list in those weight classes. I think this guy, both at middleweight and light heavyweight, could be a monster and have an amazing resume. So I think that actually might get better and better on the resume, how dangerous that guy is. So then, obviously, the problem is recency bias. Yeah, it looked absolute shit when Adesanya lost to Strickland. It looked like his head wasn't in it. He got bizarrely stylistically counted in a way he didn't seem to understand how to get out of. He actually looked a bit gun shy in that fight at times. Like he just couldn't believe he was losing and getting peppered up. I mean, the idea you can fight with a Philly shell defense and then Adesanya's not even ever going to properly wing at you and hit shots on you. I actually felt like he really underestimated that opponent and thought that was like a tune-up fight or like an easy one. I think if he won, he was even going to like flame the UFC and say like, it's too easy an opponent and like, I'm looking to the next fight so I can become the greatest of all time and retire. But since he lost, I'm hoping like Usman, there's actually lights a fire and he does a comeback. So I actually think when you go and look at it, the problem he's got a bit of the Mighty Mouse. Like some of these names, like Marvin Vettori, Jared Cannonier, Paulo Costa. Will these people be remembered as like some of the greatest fighters of all time? Probably not. Let's be real. These names will fade into the past. Now, at the same time, though, you look at Yoel Romero and Robert Whittaker. I even think Kevin Gastelum's pretty solid. You obviously look at Alex Pereira. These are names that will endure. These are names that are like great fighters of their era and potentially have done special things or might do special things in the future. So again, I wouldn't put him. I also think, by the way, eye test. Look, I like the technical skill of his fighting style. I find it very entertaining to watch. But there are many times where he has the Anderson Silva problem pre-Chael Sonnen, where he does just go a little bit too gun-shy and he's waiting for the other guy to give him the easy shot that he can do the counter-punch and then win off that. And so it does make some of the fights a bit boring or a bit decision-y when you'd rather have an exciting Anderson Silva knockout, which is the best version of Anderson Silva, not the you fight with Thiago Leites or whatever and just circle around each other for 4 minutes, not even punching each other. So I do think, like, he doesn't deserve to be the GOAT. I wouldn't even put him in my short circle. But I do think he has to be considered. Then we have got Dan Henderson. Another person, by the way, after he beat Fedor, who at the time had lost a couple of times but had been considered unbeatable, since that's going up to heavyweight to fight Fedor, a lot of people said maybe Dan Henderson's the GOAT after that. Because obviously he had been like a Pride champion. He'd been the Strikeforce champion. He came close to being the UFC champion, fought many times at middleweight. So this guy, and he obviously had all the wrestling backgrounds. So a lot of people thought like, he's like the younger Randy Couture. Like, this is the GOAT. This guy is insane. And you go look at his resume, he does have a phenomenal resume. Like you go down here, it's just the problem is, one, the Fedor win hasn't aged as well. Fedor already had clearly gone off the boil and was older at that point in time. And then two, he just didn't get the big wins he needed. He actually has the Daniel Cormier things, a couple of key wins that you just don't get if you're Dan Henderson. So if we go all the way back, he's another guy that was fighting in the 90s and already against people, you know, like this is Nogueira. This is Big Nog. This is a monster you're fighting and you're beating him in Japan. By the way, Babalu was no joke. He was a dangerous fighter. Vanderlei Silva. So you lose, but to Vanderlei Silva, this is prime Vanderlei Silva. This is 2000. This is a guy who's a fucking beast in the next few years. Then you go up, you beat Enzo Gracie, you keep going, you lose to Ricardo Arona. Ricardo Arona was a skilled all-around fighter, by the way. This is a guy, you might remember him when he fought with Rampage. Then you have another one against Nog. You lose this one. By the way, Nogueira, one of the best fighters of all time. He just didn't have enough championships for me to put him on this particular list. But again, just outside this list for someone like that. You go, obviously, when you're fighting in Japan, by the way, look, you're getting a lot of activity in here. You keep going. He has another fight with Big Nog and loses. So you see, these are some of the losses that cost you. He beats a lot of the obvious Japanese fighters, manages to lose to one of them in the Pride Grand Prix. Beats Vitor Belfort, absolutely no joke. This is actually when Vitor Belfort is a stud. He beats Vanderlei Silva when Vanderlei Silva is in theory a stud. That's when he wins the Pride Middleweight Championship. He loses to Rampage. Rampage is one of the best fighters ever at that weight class. So if you notice also, light heavyweight was the ultimate weight class for everyone just knocking each other out and having crazy periods where people didn't defend the title. He fought Anderson Silva back in the UFC, because it's back in the UFC. What a run, by the way, to fight fucking Vanderlei, slightly towards the end for Vanderlei. Rampage when Rampage is still good, and Anderson Silva when Anderson Silva is still peak. This was a hell of a run. The problem is you just lost two of the fights. This one here where he gets sobbed by Anderson Silva, that's the fight that could have changed his career. If he somehow was at peak level and won that fight, everything's different. But that one haunted him. He never quite got back from that. He beat Palahares, who used to just fucking obviously knee bar every other fucker in the world. He beat Rich Franklin, who had been a champion but years earlier. He beat Michael Bisping. Everyone remembers this one. It's the famous knockout that all the memes came from. This is before Bisping really leveled up and became like a champion himself. This is when he was just around the contender level. He lost to Jake Shields, who, by the way, was a fantastic Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighter, was a very legit fighter, actually. If anything, it's just being outside of the UFC for too long cost him. He beat Babalu in a rematch, because this is back in Strikeforce here. He became the Strikeforce middleweight champion. He lost to Jake Shields for that earlier. By the way, from what I remember of that fight, like there was chances to win that one. He could have won that one and been middleweight champion. Then he won the Strikeforce lightweight championship. Everyone's not going to remember this one with Fei Zhao, but Fei Zhao was considered like a talent at the time. It's just Strikeforce was a much smaller organization than the UFC. Then he beat Fedor, as I said, knocked him out at that. He beat Shogun Rua, where, here's the thing, Shogun Rua was never old. He's not even that old now. He just had a lot of wear and tear. He'd already had the 2 knee surgeries. But this is, I still think this might be the best MMA fight of all time. The first Shogun versus Henderson fight. It's a crazy rock'em sock'em robot, and it's all about heart, but man alive. First of all, you judge that fight. I think you can come out with the winner all over the place. And then secondly, that's a fucking war. That's a fight where people gave everything. That might be the best fight ever. Amazing fight, and he wins that. Then he loses to Machida, but he did. He lost to Rashad Evans. These were two great fighters at the time, getting a little bit out of their championship sort of domain. Vitor Belfort. Notice how crazy the resume of people he's fought this is. He fights Vitor Belfort and gets knocked out when that was, let's say, pumped up. Vitor Belfort. He won the rematch against Shogun. This one was a knockout as well. It was starting like a great fight, but it was much shorter. He lost to Daniel Cormier, who at this point in time is great. He lost to Musashi, who I think is one of the most underrated fighters ever. He just doesn't deserve to be on this list, but a fabulous, well-rounded fighter. He beat Tim Boach, who was an all-right fighter, a journeyman who had some good wins. He lost to Vitor Belfort. He shouldn't be fucking even fighting Vitor Belfort, let's say, in the era of chemicals. Like, I mean, to be fair, look, I don't think Dan Henderson was just eating wheat and drinking milk. Let's put it that way. Then he fought Hector Lombard. I guess in this way, fair's fair. He is fighting all the people who look like fucking superheroes themselves. Beat Hector Lombard. And then he lost to Michael Bisping in, I would say, a mildly controversial decision. Like, you could say maybe he won that fight on decision. It wasn't that great a fight, in my opinion. And also, people, I think, spiritually just felt like Bisping deserved it. But I think it's pretty close. He was pretty old at this point in time already, though. What a career he had. Look, he had a lot of losses, but too, he had a lot of wins, and he had a lot of strong opponents he fought. The problem is, I do think he just lost too many of the big fights he needed to. And along the way, he has a lot of random losses as well to people where either they're on the come up or it's just a random loss out of nowhere. He just had too many fights. He's one of those guys who looked like he just never said no to a fight. He's an absolute gamer in that sense. I think if he'd have won the UFC title, or he'd beat Anderson Silva, or he'd have gotten back to a second Anderson Silva title fight, which he was always gunning for in the UFC, that would have been his chance to maybe go to the last category, the Elite Club, and be on the GOAT list itself. But I just consider him a nominee. Then we have Alexander Volkanovski. You'll notice a lot of the modern champions who've defended a lot of times, I have to put them on the list. Like, there aren't many fighters, guys, who've been a champion of a UFC division and then defended like 4 or 5 times. Like, that is very special. That's even crazy. Not spoiler, there are no women on this list. Use your fucking head. But even so, you have to consider all these modern day guys. It's just the point is, they don't get to actually be on the elite list, but I have to put them in the convo. Maybe in 10 years, some of these guys graduate and some of the other people come off that list. Who knows, right? So if we go to Volkanovski, one of my favourite modern day fighters, a fighter with the eye test, checks out like a motherfucker, really all-round skilled fighter, can do it all, amazing heart, and what a record he's had. There's a reason why I actually did also think both before and after the first Makhachev fight that this guy was the pound-for-pound best fighter in MMA. So you go down, obviously who cares about the random names at this point in time. Then you come to the UFC. Okay, these are people we're starting to get to know, but they're not really that known. You only have Chad Mendes over here, fight of the night. He's 19-1, another person whose record's a bit overhyped. But he knocks out Chad Mendes. Chad Mendes was a true contender-level fighter at this weight class. And it's a bit later. Then he fights and beats Jose Aldo. Jose Aldo's on my GOAT nominee list earlier on in this. Then he fights Max Holloway. By the way, part of me felt like I should maybe even have included Max Holloway on this list. It's just that I think he has a more extreme version of, like, he has a championship and he has some defenses, but they're not as crazy as you think. And a lot of actually Jose Aldo later in his career gifts a lot of the big wins to Max Holloway. But even so, Max Holloway, a very strong contender fighter. And this is obviously when Max Holloway was himself trying to just be like a gamer. I'll fight anyone and just go down as one of the greats. He fought him a whole bunch of times and he won all 3 of them. That's big. Max Holloway is a nice win to have on your resume. Brian Ortega was an up and comer. I actually don't know himself if he'll ever be at the championship level again, but he's certainly at contender level and was exciting. Korean Zombie's a bit old at this point in time, but you knock him out. Like, it's pretty fucking great, isn't it? You beat Holloway again. I actually think you can make the case on the Makhachev fight that either of them won that one. I think it's a really close decision again. I think the way it ended, spiritually, it feels like Volkanovski won, but I might have still just scored it for Makhachev overall. But I think for the guy from a low weight class to fight the champion of a division and do that is incredibly impressive. That's why, for me, he was the pound-for-pound number 1 after that fight. Then he has the Yair Rodriguez fight. Yair Rodriguez is a dangerous contender. Doesn't matter. Took care of him. Then he came back, short notice, and gambled again on the Makhachev one. It reminds me so much of BJ Penn against GSP, because let's be real, now that you're knocked out it feels like a mistake, but at the time you were going for history. Like, if you win that fight, the joke is, on this video I myself probably immediately move you into the 2 or 3 GOAT candidates, and maybe you can even be the GOAT. So I do love the ambition of going for it, and I think in general you can only gain when you go for those fights, because if you win you gain, if you lose it's not your weight class. I don't judge you that harshly. You can just go back down to lightweight or featherweight, where you're champion, and just keep fighting there and be the champion. That's fine. So I do think Volkanovski is an example of someone on this list who still has a chance to get to the GOAT list, who could maybe one day be the GOAT. Depends how he manages his career. I do think he's a phenomenal fighter, though. Big fan of his. And I actually loved the way he fought against Makhachev. I think he just didn't turn it on soon enough in the fight. I think he tried to just feel him out a little bit too much. Then we have got another lightweight or lighter weight class fighter, and it's going to be Henry Cejudo. This is the last of the people who are just nominees. The next 4 are going to be my actual contenders, and I'll tell you who the GOAT is. So Henry Cejudo is a phenomenal fighter, not just because outside of MMA, he has like the UFC gold medal, etc., and did all sorts of things in wrestling. But then you go and you look at some of the wins he has in his career. So we'll go back. He hasn't been fighting that long. He comes in, and already these are people we know. He gets to fight Mighty Mouse. Mighty Mouse beats him. Mighty Mouse is the champion. Mighty Mouse TKOs him. Oh, big, hard loss, right? Then he loses to Joseph Benavidez, always a gamer, always competitive. It's not looking that good. You're 10-2 in your career. Then he comes back and he just goes on a tear. Look, knocks out Wilson Rice. Sergio Pettis, the brother of Anthony Pettis, decisions him. He fights Mighty Mouse for the championship, beats him, fight of the night, wins that. Fights TJ Dillashaw, who, if you remember, was himself someone who, championship fighter in a different weight class, phenomenal fighter all in all, beats him, knockout. Another knockout, Moraes, even though he's not that great a fighter all in all, might one day end up being. Then he has the fight against Dominick Cruz, short term, I think it was. This is fantastic, wins convincingly. Now, the problem he has is this. I already think he has a short resume, but he has some very good wins and very good opponents he's faced. I mean, look at this. Mighty Mouse, TJ Dillashaw, Dominick Cruz. These are all wins. These are very good fighters to have wins over. I think the issue is, one, not quite enough work done on the resume because he came into MMA late and then he tried to retire and say he was the GOAT already because he'd won the different championships. But the real killer for me is this, is he already was a champion in flyweight and bantamweight, right? He actually, for real... This is another fight where I can see why some people think that like he edged it over Sterling. I personally would give it to Sterling overall. Thought he controlled the fight generally. There's times, especially late, where it looked like Cejudo was doing awesome. I am a Cejudo fan, but he also did look like the range got to him a little bit and he maybe held back some of his combos. He was a bit worried about getting taken down, in my opinion, at times in that fight, bizarrely. And so I do think he lost that one. I think if he'd have won that and he'd have beaten Sterling and he'd have been another time champion, I think that is enough actually where I would now have him. It would now be 5 names for the GOAT. Because I do think if he'd have beaten another championship level fighter, yes, we all know the Peter Yan jazz with this fucking guy, I do think he would have a better resume than people. Put it this way, I think he already has a better resume than Khabib. I think this would have been a fabulous one. I think this is a guy where if I just look at the eye test, he might be the GOAT. I think his eye test is phenomenal. He's got fucking crazy power in his hands if he wants to. He could submit you. He could wrestle you. He's actually quite fast. I kind of like his stance a little bit. I think the Aljamain Sterling fight is one of the only fights I've actually seen once he reached peak powers where maybe strategically he didn't fight that well. He's also quite a good tactician, I feel like. It's the reason why if you ever watch his YouTube channel, he does seem like he'd be a great coach. He's got a great mind for working down the game and what to do and where the weaknesses are. So I think he's a fantastic fighter. Really, really checks out. As I say, I actually think the Sterling angle could have put him at GOAT status. Now we have the 4 names that I actually think the GOAT is in. And the reason why there's 4 names for this is simple. Depending on what month it is, what day it is, if any of them still fight, most of them don't. It depends on what the day is. Sometimes I think all 4 of them are the GOAT. So here are the 4 names. Fedor Emelianenko, heavyweight. Anderson Silva, middleweight. George St-Pierre, welterweight. Jon Jones, light heavyweight, and then modern day heavyweight. These are the 4 people I think are the GOAT. One of them. And I can change up all of them, but in the end, I will pick the one I think is the GOAT. So for Fedor, this is obviously a more old school fighter, but you go back here. So first things first, famous thing about Fedor is that until this loss here to Verdum, where he got submitted by the triangle, it says here that that's his second loss. But the reality is, the loss here was an accidental cut against Big Nog. That's it. It's a no contest. So in reality, realistically, and by the way, he also beat Big Nog in the next fight. If you count that as a win, or just ignore it, he essentially was undefeated from 2000 until 2010. So about 9 years undefeated, fighting most of the best fighters at heavyweight and across the world. That is insane. I actually think Fedor has the best eye test of any fighter ever. He has a fantastic, one of the best resumes of any fighter ever, and skill set, incredibly all around. The insane clutch factor. There's a reason he was called the last emperor. He looked like the final boss of MMA. So we'll go all the way back. Right in the early days, notice how many of these already have a Wikipedia. By the way, a bunch of these are known people. Ricardo Arona's a known fighter. This is Babalu's a known fighter. You go up, Semi Schilt was a legendary, massive kickboxer guy that Fedor fought. Heath Herring was a guy from the UFC who was considered like a good heavyweight. He fought Big Nog and beat him a decision. Big Nog was, at the time, the champion of Pride, I think. He was a fantastic, one of the best BJJ heavyweights ever. Really strong fighter, nice all-around game. Convincingly beaten by Fedor. Fedor's ground and pounded the fuck out of him. You keep going up, he beats a bunch of these. Gary Goodridge was like a solid fighter, dangerous fighter from the UFC. Knocked the fuck out of him. He beat Mark Coleman, who was like sort of like the proto Dan Henderson, just a strong wrestler with big hands. Subbed him. He beat Kevin Randleman. This is the legendary one where Kevin Randleman, massive jacked wrestler guy, dumps Fedor on his head. Fedor spins out of it and Kimura's him straight up. What a fucking, one of the craziest wins of all time. Then you look, he has a couple more fights against Big Nog. So, he has the other 2 fights against Big Nog here. One's a no contest, but he gets the heavyweight championship. He fights Cro Cop when Cro Cop was the scariest fighter in the world. He'd not only just fucked up Fedor's brother, Alexander, but he'd also beaten, like, knocked the fuck out of Wanderlei Silva. Everyone was scared of Cro Cop. And by the way, this is not only a classic fight where Cro Cop does everything he can, but one, Cro Cop gets neutralized by Fedor, just beats him in every area, including matching him in striking. And quite frankly, it looked like Cro Cop was the one a little bit shook by this fight that he couldn't knock him out. Then you keep going, Mark Coleman again, beats Mark Hunt, who obviously later had the renaissance in the UFC where he was a monster. At this point in time, he was in kind of a bit more of a dodgy period in his career. Matt Lindland, I mean, he's just an all right journeyman fighter. Hongman Choice, that giant guy, if people remember. Tim Sylvia, only a few years earlier, I think maybe a year earlier, had been the UFC champion. It's only fuckers like Dana White downplay this guy and make out like he was a bum. Spoiler, Andrei Arlovski years later is back in the UFC now, like a decade plus later, still fighting a heavyweight. But now we're supposed to pretend when they fight Fedor outside the UFC, they're bums. But like, just before that, they're the best fighter in the world, and Randy Couture beating Tim Sylvia makes Randy Couture the GOAT. So he bought Tim Sylvia. This is the one where he just wrecked him super early in the fight. Then he fought Andrei Arlovski. Andrei Arlovski sort of winning early, then just gets knocked the fuck out. Then Brett Rogers is winning and looking actually like physically dominating Fedor, but then Fedor just crazy Hail Mary knocks him the fuck out. At the time, you could tell Fedor already, by the way, has lost a little bit of his physical strength. He's getting a bit older. In theory, he's got to lose eventually, but he's just stealing wins out of nowhere. It just felt like the gods were with him. So then finally, he has his losing streak where he stops being the number one guy. He lost to Verdum because Fedor's style was he would fearlessly dive into your guard and just beat you the fuck up. Like, he'd be like Big Nog doing that. Big Nog's an amazing submission artist. So when he fought against Verdum is maybe the best submission artist ever. It's between him, Big Nog, and Frank Mir, probably. Like, Verdum caught him. He's the first person to properly catch him and actually sub him. This was a fantastic counter to his style. Then they had the Bigfoot fight. Now, this is before certain things with chemicals, but Bigfoot fucking ragdolled Fedor on this. It was actually, it was outrageous how he was beating the fuck out of him. This is why, to me, Fedor's, like this is in the years later, but guys, this is in 2011. How old's Fedor now? He was born in 1976. So in 2011, we're talking about he'd be like, what, 35 or something? He's already quite old. And crucially, like Daniel Cormier, he's an undersized heavyweight. He actually probably should have fought light heavyweight most of his career. So then you go back, and he's another person who, this is where, after this loss, the Dan Henderson one, he probably should just stop fighting. Like, he won't ever be the best fighter in the world again, or a UFC, or a champion who didn't fight in the UFC, obviously. After that, he fights these joke fights, where he fights Jeff Monson, Ishii, and Rizzo. The problem is, they used to be good fighters, like, unironically, 10 to 15 years earlier. Like, they're mega washed at this point in time. So he gets to get all these BS wins, and all I'll say is, maybe he has connections to some shady people and that's why these fights happen. Who knows on that, right? So you keep going up. No one really cares about most of these. This guy was all right. If you remember in the UFC, he had some heart. You keep going up. He lost to Matt Mitrione, who was a bit of a meathead. You can already tell it's sort of gone. He beats Frank Mir in Bellator. Beats Chael Sonnen, convenient. He lost to a lot of people. He was a good fighter. Lost to Ryan Beard. It was mad underwhelming, that one. Just lost pretty quickly. He beat Rampage when Rampage is mega old and no one cares. Beat Timothy Johnson, who cares? He lost to Ryan Beard again. Ryan Beard never quite was ever like a true championship level fighter in the UFC. He was just like an above average journeyman type fighter who got beat by the best. So Fedor just kept fighting for too long. If you go back to the earlier portion of his career, if you go back to, let's say, this portion, I'll even say, I actually do think for the Rogers one, that was sort of a Hail Mary, that win. Like, if you just stop at the Andrei Arlovski one, so he's 30 and let's say 29-0, we'll take the no contest off. That fighter there could be the GOAT. Eye test tells me he might be the greatest fighter ever, might have had the best overall for his era, skill set, well-rounded. He fought all the opposition. It's only Randy Couture he didn't fight. And by the way, in the meantime, Randy Couture's losing to fucking Brock Lesnar and stuff like that. So, like, what do you want me to do? So I thought Pride was better than the UFC at the time, especially for heavyweights. And this guy beat them all and won when it mattered and was a fantastic, amazing fighter who was seemingly unbeatable. So, yeah, incredible. Insane poise, amazing mentality, didn't seem to ever get faced. Just the last emperor of MMA, right? Then we're going to have Anderson Silva. Now, if you want to talk about eye test, in the fights where people engaged with him, I think he had I think the scariest fighter is Prime Fedor because he couldn't be beaten. But I think the scariest fighter in terms of you're worried he'll actually just knock you the fuck out is Anderson Silva. It's why his boring fights are when other people just refuse to fire and are like, I'm going to make him fire first. It just makes it a rubbish fight, which happened a couple of times in his career. So let's go all the way back because this is another fighter that stuck around too long and we'll just use part of his career. So if we go all the way back here, so we don't really care as much about a bunch of these fights. Some of these are okay opponents. Jeremy Horn's a good fighter. Lee Murray is actually like quite a skilled fighter. If people don't remember, he's the one who got in some criminal problems. It's a great fight, by the way. And it's a really back and forth fight, but it just shows how tough Anderson Silva is. This is the one where the guy just runs and jumps and while in midair, does a fucking heel hook onto Anderson Silva and wins the fight instantly in Pride. It was a really nuts fight, but what an out of nowhere fight. Jorge Rivera's just a journeyman who cares, knocked out. Yushin Akami, this is where Anderson Silva gets a loss from an illegal kick. But in reality, Yushin Akami was a strong contender level fighter with a nice wrestling game. But like, this isn't a real loss. And this is the guy who later on, Anderson Silva rematches and beat the fuck out of him, went in the Matrix on. Tony Frickland, this was the classic one where he did the from like Ong Bak or whatever that he practiced with his wife. Then he came to the UFC. Chris Laban is legendary for having an amazing jaw, especially at this point. Anderson Silva KOs him and just shows that like, you might have a great jaw, but I'm just going to keep hitting it, mate. Then the Rich Franklin one. Rich Franklin had been the champion. He gets his face rearranged by these fucking clinch knees from Muay Thai. Travis Lutter was whatever. Obviously, people don't remember that one. I think, quite frankly, if you saw Travis Lutter in that fight, it's almost like inhuman that they allowed that fight to go. You look at, he had no moisture left in his body and he missed weight. Then they had the Nate Marquardt. By the way, Nate Marquardt, here's the thing about Anderson Silva. Nate Marquardt, Yushin Okami, and Chael Sonnen were fucking murderers in this weight class. They were all really strong contender level or championship level fighters. And the point is, it is Anderson Silva that prevented these guys becoming champions. Otherwise, they would have been UFC champions. So he actually knocks out Nate Marquardt. Then he beats Rich Franklin in the rematch. He beats Dan Henderson, who people want to believe is going to be a champion because of pride, etc. James Irwin's a bit whatever. I actually think that one was a bit, it's not really the greatest opponent, is it? Knocks him out. Patrick Courtier one is where Patrick Courtier's knee just like pops out and it's kind of a rubbish fight to that point. Talas Lates almost got this guy fired because this is where he just made it a boring ass fight where nothing happened. He refused to engage with him and then was even being a bit of a dickhead. Then he went up a weight class and had the exhibition fight against Forrest Griffin where he just went in the Matrix and wrecked Forrest Griffin. Then he fought Damian Maia, and this is the one that really almost got him fired because he was refusing to fight and just talking to him and lying down, even though Damian Maia had been a monster in the division. So that one was whack, but Chael Sonnen saved this guy's career. Because when Chael Sonnen came and almost beat him, that's one of the closest losses you'll ever see. Sonnen's lost to Silva in this fight where Silva supposedly has a busted rib, and he just at the last moment in the last round pulls out a triangle. Sonnen was going to win that, but crucially, the hero-villain dynamic of Sonnen as the villain and the face getting to be Anderson Silva again, and the fact that he wins by submission and he's losing, and there's all this totally vivified the career of Anderson Silva, made him a fan favourite again. He's won, and it set up this awesome story now with Chael Sonnen, who was one of the biggest draws and the heels in MMA at the time. Then he had the win over Vitor Belfort, which was just God tier. That was a fucking insane KO. He fought Okami for the rematch. Okami definitely got shook, and once he got hit, looked like he was scared. He fucking went in the Matrix and beat him. He had another exhibition against Stephan Bonner, which was to some degree more ridiculous than the Forrest Griffin one. Forrest Griffin one, he was just in the Matrix dodging the punches. This is the one where he kept intentionally putting himself on the cage so that then Stephan Bonner could punch him, but then he was either taking and rolling with him, so they weren't hurting him, and then just decided at one point, right, I'm bored of just letting you do that now. I'm just going to knock you the fuck out. And did that crazy like knee into his solar plexus and just fucked him up instantly. That was terrifying. That Anderson Silva, if you pause there, who's 33-4, and one of them's that crazy flying heel hook in fucking Pride. That fighter there again could be the GOAT. That's an incredibly scary, dominant fighter who's beaten all comers. Obviously, the Chael Sonnen fight was close. And at that point in time, he can retire. And if he'd have retired that moment, people would talk about him even more crazy than they talk about Khabib. They would say this guy is the GOAT and nobody would ever have beaten him. Now, it turns out he actually loses his next two fights. He got knocked out by Chris Weidman, legit. Yeah, he was showboating a bit, but he got caught. And then the second one, famously, his leg snapped and Chris Weidman checked it. Now, I will say, it's not as simple as saying, yeah, but if he just didn't, like, dance for the cameras and mug, they would... No. Chael Sonnen nailed this years ago, and I think he's right. That showboating was also part of Anderson Silva's style, where because Anderson Silva is a counterpuncher, He wants to lull you into fighting him either by angering you, doing silly things, or just dodging and humiliating you and making it feel like you have to keep fighting and doing activity. And he's waiting when you do that so that then when you miss, he will hit you. He will knock you the fuck out. He will catch you. He will clip you in the right moment. That's why it's incredibly dangerous to think anyone like Chris Weidman could just knock him out when he like showboats. Like, no, Chris Weidman, first of all, was a fabulous fighter at the time and had the skill set to do it. And crucially, had the power to catch him in this way. And who knows what happens in that second fight if Anderson Silva's leg doesn't snap. Then you have the Nick Diaz one, which was just boring. All the fights from the Nick Diaz one onwards may as well just be exhibition fights. I don't care that he wins or loses them. They're fantastic opponents he's fighting. But at this point in his career, it's more like he's fighting for the fans even. He doesn't even look like he's a tactician or point fighter at this point. He quite frankly doesn't even seem to care about knockouts. There's a lot of decisions here at this point. And yeah, I just don't think he should have kept fighting. People don't know. When he was a champion, he was already quite old. Look, he's a champion in up until 2013. Right, Anderson Silva, that's when he's like, what, almost, he's like 37 or something crazy at that point in time. Like, that's pretty ridiculous that he's still on top at that point. So I think he just shouldn't have kept fighting beyond that. That's the main problem he has. I think the last 10 years have deleted people's memory of how scary and good this guy was. But you look at who he fought, man, he's fought a lot of strong people. He cleared out his whole division out of contenders, and he even fucked up a couple. Like, Forrest Griffin was one time the champion of the light heavyweight division. He fucked him up, made him look like an absolute clown who couldn't even fight. So yeah, I think what a fantastic fighter. Another person where, there's a few years ago, this is another person I often used to, like, let's say, if I wake up some days and I think it's Fedor, and then other days I think, it's Jon Jones, and then my head tells me, could it be GSP? Anderson Silva is one of the strongest ones I do come back to. Like, if I just think of the highlights, though, he goes back to the top of the list. I think he just has some of the best highlights ever in the UFC. Right, there's only two left. GSP and Jon Jones, right? A lot of people's picks for number one, especially before all the Khabib nephews came along. So the thing with GSP is this. One, he does have the unique factor, right? Look, Jon Jones, I actually don't think ever lost in the sense that, like, I don't know actually, because sometimes I think he lost the Reyes fight. But I actually do think, like I said, I probably do edge the Gustafsson fight to him. And I don't care about the no contest against Matt Hamill, the DQ, or whatever. So as a result, in theory, Jon Jones hasn't lost ever. And Khabib never lost, but didn't fight enough top people. GSP, people forget, did lose, but crucially, it was early in his career and not when he was like the really zenith champion. So it feels like he didn't lose. That's why I get why when he retired, even before he came back for the Bisping fight, a lot of people did have him on paper as their GOAT. But the problem I think with GSP is he's the paper GOAT, and we'll get into why. I don't think the eye test and the actual, like, how he won his fights check out for him to be the GOAT. But you go and you look, first things first, fantastic technical fighter. One of the best technical fighters ever outside of his jiu-jitsu, even though he's also been able to submit people eventually. Amazing boxing for MMA, great jab that he used very famously, the Superman punch. Unbelievable wrestling, maybe the best MMA wrestler ever. I actually think that's why him versus Khabib was the dream fight. He didn't tend to sub people, but he understood jiu-jitsu, and he did get a few. I mean, John Danaher's his fucking coach, is one of the best Brazilian jiu-jitsu thinkers ever. He beat every big contender as far as I'm concerned. Look, I actually think maybe Big Rig Henderson beat him. I actually think maybe the judges should have given that one. But aside from that, everyone else he did beat. The problem is, a lot of them were decisions. So if we go down and look, if we go all the way down here, it's around here it starts to get interesting. He comes to the UFC. Karo Parisian was a dangerous judo guy who I think had drug problems maybe, and once upon a time was headed to the top of the division. He beats him. Heron was all right as well. TKOs him. I think Chael Sonnen said it best. In 3-round fights, GSP was really exciting. But you put him in 5-round fights, and he had to space it out. He had to keep some energy in the tank. He couldn't go for the finish the same way. So then he fights, and he loses. His first chance to win the championship is against Matt Hughes, and he gets subbed with an armbar. Comes back, he armbars Dave Strasser, he beats Jason Miller, Mayhem, who at the time, by the way, was a solid fighter. People like John Fitch, Miller, these were solid enough fighters who themselves maybe could have been a champion, but people like GSP took care of them. That's the thing about GSP. At one point, BJ Penn, Fedor, Anderson Silva, the amount of people who would have been champions who never got to be because of these guys shows why these guys are the GOAT candidates. Like, they're like Michael Jordan in the 90s. There's plenty of amazing basketballs played then. But the problem is Michael Jordan played, so you don't get to be the champion. Then he beats Frank Trigg, another above average fighter. Sean Sherk's a contender fighter. He beats BJ Penn. That's pretty fucking legit. By the way, he's knocking out and submitting some of these people. He beats BJ. Like I said, I think that one was the more questionable one. But okay, I slightly edge it to him. He knocks out Matt Hughes to become the champion, but then he loses in fluke fashion to Matt Serra, and this really was just he kept getting clipped. A really crazy one. Beat Josh Koscheck, himself is a contender, above average fighter for many, many years. He comes back, he subs Matt Hughes, wins the championship. He gets revenge on Matt Serra, including a TKO, brilliant. He beats John Fitch, who was kind of like diet GSP, a very good, strong all-around fighter, a lot of decisions. People just thought he was more boring, whereas GSP was Canadian, so he had this crazy like charisma and was a box office draw, even though he was a bit of a decision fighter. He beats BJ in the super fight, TKO, very impressive win. Thiago Alves was a dangerous kickboxing, Muay Thai type fighter, and he took care of him. Decision, did not get finished. A lot of people were saying he's going to knock out GSP. Fought Dan Hardy. Now this one, he did fuck up the like Kimura or whatever. He probably should have actually won this by sub, but he wasn't able to. Dan Hardy actually isn't really a contender level fighter. He's slightly below that, but he kind of got the Masvidal rise really quickly, and people just wanted to see him fight because he's from the UK. Josh Koscheck was actually a strong fighter. This was the one where GSP just fucked his eye up all fight long, if I remember correctly. Jake Shields, at the time, was one of the absolute best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu people and had been the champion of Strikeforce. Took care of him convincingly. Carlos Condit caught him for a moment with that head kick. But other than that, GSP fought back, was a warrior. He did win that fight. The Nick Diaz one, I actually think he convincingly beat Nick Diaz. I think Nick Diaz actually was in his own head on that one and just didn't fight normally like he normally should, and just seemed like he actually got beaten up by GSP. He didn't get smashed, but he got beaten up by him. The Hendricks one, like I say, part of me feels like Hendricks won that, but I also think it felt like on the judges' scorecards he should have won off the first like 3 or 4 rounds. I think he went too light towards the end of the fight, so I think he fucked that one up himself, even though I could have seen a world where potentially Hendricks won. Also would have been a convenient way for GSP to just retire, right, when he lost. But he never did ever actually lose the title once he had got past the Matt Serra loss earlier on. And then coming back years later, look at this gap, almost 4 years to the day later, he comes back, fights in a higher weight class against the middleweight champion, who was at the time Michael Bisping, and he beats him and retires with the second championship in a different weight class. This guy, I mean, by the way, that was a very close fight. Michael Bisping had his chances in that fight. What a phenomenal fucking run. What a resume as well. The problem is too many decisions. Just too many decisions at the title level. That's the only real issue I have. Because realistically, if you include judges' decisions, he did beat every contender or got revenge on them. He beat John Fitch. He beat Carlos Condit. He beat Nick Diaz. He beat BJ Penn. He beat Jake Shields. He beat Matt Hughes. These people were either champions of other organizations, or true contenders. He beat them all. It didn't matter if you were good at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he could sub you. It didn't matter if you were good at fighting, he could knock people out and tool them up with boxing. It didn't matter if you were a really dangerous striker, you don't knock GSP out. It doesn't matter if you're great at jiu-jitsu, you don't sub GSP usually. It doesn't matter what you try to do. He's the guy where, crucially, look, Jon Jones used to intentionally do to you what your strength was. GSP would just shut your strength down. I've always said it's like Astralis in Counter-Strike, if people know the analogy. It won't actually look super exciting when he wins, because he just shuts your strength down, and it's actually, if you know the context of the strength of the fighter being shut down, it's what they're not able to do that is incredible, not what they then do or what GSP does to them. I do think, unfortunately, he lacked a little bit of killer instinct in terms of finishing, though. I think if he finishes more of these fights, he would be my number one. Because I do think on paper it's hard to argue with. It's just the eye test and then the lack of finishes, I do think is a bit of an issue overall. Too many decisions for me. And even though he did fight Michael Bisping later and win the middleweight championship, he should have gone up and fought Anderson Silva in a super fight. BJ Penn did it to him. He had his chance to. And by the way, if he'd have gone up and he'd have beaten Anderson Silva, even in a catchweight fight, that also might have made him number one on this list, because it might have eye test showed us maybe he is the greatest fighter ever. So I do think it's why I say when I do all these ones, it's normally Jon Jones, Fedor, or Anderson when I'm thinking of the highlights, how good they were, how scary they were. GSP is just the thinking man's GOAT. I look at the resume, I look at how he won, I look at the context. It is very impressive, but a lot of it's cerebral. A lot of it's like the sophisticated palate. It's not as much like, wow, my eyes tell me he was the best. My heart tells me he was the best. So now we've got one fighter left. And I've left him till the end for a reason. Jon Jones, by the way, he's currently the heavyweight champion. Maybe he can even keep winning more fights and solidify himself as the GOAT. The problem obviously is, here's what's funny. Even the downsides of Jon Jones' career is why he probably is my GOAT. And here's why. Because, or there's many days I wake up and my heart tells me he's the GOAT. Because when I look at his career, He himself had years and years off because of all the issues of the PEDs and criminal issues. And then he had periods where he'd been such a dickhead. People claim that either they couldn't book him with the big fights, or maybe people didn't even want to fight him anymore. Maybe they think he cheats and he's going to eye poke you. So he did, to some degree, not get the most out of his career. And he definitely wasn't the most diligent. And he clearly was like fucking around with drugs and partying. But even with all of that said, you can take all of that away. Ignore what I just said there. Just look at his resume. He might be the GOAT. This guy's insane. First of all, except for if you think Reyes or Gustafsson beat him straight up, he didn't really ever lose. This Matt Hamill one is just because he was doing elbows like that. That's it. Matt Hamill would never fucking beat Jon Jones. So if you go back, Jon Jones was a young phenom. He's still a champion now as an older fighter. So you go back, right? Beating Stephan Bonner already announced that, hey, this guy's legit. It's a decision, but he already showed, again, he's fucking scary. Then he subs this guy. Like, we forget this one. He beats Vanderveer, who I pointed out had potential. This guy, the janitor, Matyushenko, was considered like, he's like a solid veteran. Maybe he can like humble the youngster. No, he easily taken care of. Easily. The Ryan Bader one, he just bodies him. Then he fights for the championship. A lot of people said at the time, he's too young. He shouldn't be bumped up. Shogun's going to eat him up. Shogun's the best fighter in the world at that weight class. By the way, I actually do think Shogun could have been on this list. It's just he didn't have quite as crazy a resume. One of my favourite fighters of all time at that weight class, like heavyweight, particularly fantastic in Pride. He fights him. He absolutely fucked Shogun's world up. Now, yes, this is Shogun after 2 leg surgeries, but he's the champion. So it's not prime Shogun, but it's still a legit fighter who later go on to have that greatest fight of all time with Dan Henderson. So this was an amazing way to announce yourself. Then you beat Rampage and finish him, this time with a sub. You knock out Shogun. You finish Rampage with a sub. You fight Machida, sub him as well. Machida doesn't even take damage. You sub him. Then you fight Rashad Evans, who used to be in your camp and used to fight with you. Decision, but you just completely neutralise his game. He can't stop you. Then you sub Vitor Belfort, who again looks like some fucking Marvel character. Here's the problem you're having at the moment for Jon Jones. Some of these names are a bit older. Belfort, Machida, Rampage, Shogun. These aren't their absolute peak prime years, but they're still solid championship level fighters. They're still dangerous in many different ways. And you're not only beating them, you're finishing them all, and you're even finishing them all in different ways that they should be really good at. And see. So then you go, and he has the famous fight against Chael Sonnen, which technically he would have lost if the ref had noticed his toe was pointing like that. But he obviously fucked him up in the actual fight. The joke is that's why he busted his toe. And then you have the fight against Gustafsson. I actually, like I say, I can see a world where Gustafsson won it, but I also don't hate the idea Jones did do just enough in whatever it was, round 3 or 4, to get the win. Glover Teixeira, Glover was a solid fighter. The problem is, though, he did look like he was a bit shook in this fight and didn't fight his fight, but he took care of him. He beat Daniel Cormier convincingly. Then the problem here, obviously, is, look, we're not having that many fights. We're going 2012, 2013, and we have one fight in 2014, one fight in 2015, one fight in 2016, one fight in 2017. Notice how it's one fight a year up to there, because this is when all the legal problems start fucking his career up. So he comes to the comeback fight, was OSP, if you remember. I thought that it wasn't like the best fight ever, but it was a solid win. He comes back and beats Daniel Cormier in a banger fight, but he gets overturned because of the drug shenanigans. He should have been the champion. Then he came back and he knocked out Gustafsson to get revenge for what some people think spiritually was a loss. Anthony Smith was supposed to be a dangerous up-and-comer. He hasn't quite sort of delivered on that, but at the time people thought it was hard. Jon Jones beat him. Wasn't the craziest fight. Thiago Santos one is a bit whatever. It just wasn't the best fight to look at. The Dominick Reyes one, like I said, there's times I think Dominick Reyes maybe did win this fight, but I think if you look at the way the fight played and the way like octagon control and factors like of presence of how he looked like you're fighting, I think the problem Reyes has was he maybe was landing more shots or key shots, but first of all, he never came close to finishing him. And more importantly, it just gave the appearance it was So I can see why with MMA ruling that Jon Jones got to win this one. And then the Cyril Gane one, he just didn't have any ground game. He was just a fucking banger bruiser guy at heavyweight. So I don't really care that much about the heavyweight thing. This isn't like he beat Miocic or Daniel Cormier at heavyweight, the truly all-time great ones. I don't think Cyril Gane truly is like a... Look, heavyweight's a very shallow division, so he might be a contender in that one. But if you think about all-time MMA, I don't think he gets the count. But you look just at the resume, what a fucking insane resume Jon Jones has. Like, let's be real, he is good at everything. He can't be out-wrestled, but he can wrestle even great Olympic wrestlers. You can't outbox him. Maybe Gustafsson came close and Reyes was good, and he has outboxed many fighters and won on the feet and fucked people up. You do not sub him. He just does not. People don't even attempt subs because you just can't get him on this guy. Like, I guess the closest is what, like the Vitor one that he just didn't give a fuck about his arms, let it go. And then let's add this in. He's already maybe the best fighter ever, and he cheats. The guy straight up cheats. He constantly eye pokes you. So you have a choice. Oh, you don't have to stand forward and get poked in the eye, but that now means his insane range, you can never get within it. You can't duck under and fight him, right? Also, while you're now trying to dodge being eye poked, he's doing that oblique kick to fucking hyperextend your knee constantly. I think those two things are disgraceful. I think that's worse than the PED implied alleged cheating. I think this shit because you're already too good, mate. You don't need to do this. You already are maybe the best fighter ever, but you also cheat religiously. This is like when Nadal constantly cheats with the fucking medical timeouts and stuff in tennis. Like, bro, you're already fucking the best winning. Like, why you cheat as well, you fucking rat? But you look at his resume, the real problem he has, like I say, is just a lot of older fighters have enormous names, but they're not at their absolute peak. Like when he fights Rampage and Machida and Vitor, they aren't at their absolute best. But you look at some of the people he did fight in their prime, these were fantastic champions or championship level fighters themselves. He fought Daniel Cormier twice. He fought Gustafsson twice. He fought fucking Glover Teixeira and Rashad Evans and Shogun. These are either champions, a bunch of them, or they were championship level and really elite fighters. Now, he did lose those years because of the criminal shit and the PED shit. That sucks. Some people will say he lost 1 or 2 fights. Obviously, technically, he lost the Hamill fight on paper. So when you come down to it all, at the end of the video, here's basically how I resolve it. I had 4 names at the end. I had Jon Jones, Fedor, Anderson Silva, and GSP. They're the 4 fighters I actually think are contenders, true contenders for the greatest MMA fighter of all time. And here's how it goes. Realistically, GSP is just the on-paper GOAT. So I go down to Jon Jones, Anderson Silva, and Fedor. And here's how it goes. My heart often tells me I pick Fedor. He has the amazing eye test. He did win everything. He just felt like a character out of fiction who'd never lose. But my head says Jon Jones is the greatest fighter of all time. And the fact that no one could come along, even... he's just fighting older people. There's no one came along who could really properly beat this guy. And if they did, it was by a slight decision that was questionable. So my heart says Fedor, my head says Jon Jones. Who do you say? Obviously, my main gig is over in esports on my main channel, but my side channel and all my content around my other interests here are kindly supported by my Patreon community on Thorin's side here. So do you want to ask me a question for my video AMA? Do you want to take part in a private one-on-one exclusive, never to be released but recorded for you session? Call it consulting, call it just a conversation if you want. Do you want to find out who upcoming guests are for the Thor Inquiry episodes? If any or other perks like this take your interest, check out the Patreon link in the description box below and join Thorin's side today.